Hello there, and welcome to our channel. A place where the curious parts of your mind can settle in and wander gently through questions that don't always have simple answers. Tonight, we're drifting into a story that begins not in the stars, not in distant galaxies or invisible particles, but right under our feet. There's a strange and persistent idea tucked away in the corners of the internet and whispered through old architectural puzzles. An idea that suggests that long ago, the world may have folded over itself in a sudden sweep of Earth, swallowing cities and leaving only rooftops, upper floors, and quiet hints behind. It's a thought that invites you to look at the ground beneath your home and wonder what, if anything, might be hidden just a little deeper than anyone expects. So, while you settle in and let your body unwind, let's ease into the question at the heart of our journey. What if an enormous mud flood once buried ancient civilizations? Before we wander too far, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're tucked into bed. Maybe you're curled up on a sofa with a blanket pulled around your shoulders. Maybe you're listening during a long night when sleep feels just out of reach. Wherever you are, and whenever you happen to press play, it's a quiet pleasure to have you here. And if you find this kind of gentle exploration soothing, or if it keeps your mind company while you drift toward rest, a like or a subscription would help this small corner of peaceful science find others who might need a soft place to land at the end of their day. There's nothing to rush, nothing you need to do, just a simple moment shared between you, a curious idea, and a slow unfolding of possibilities. The thought of a world being swallowed in earth might sound dramatic at first. It's the kind of idea you'd expect to find in a legend or tucked into the folds of a myth that was passed down through centuries of retelling. But the reason people return to it again and again isn't because it offers a dramatic story. It's because every now and then, someone notices a doorway sitting underground, or windows that seem far too low, or entire stories of old buildings that rest beneath the present street level. And when enough of these small peculiarities gather in the same mental basket, they start to feel like they might be pieces of something larger, something from a time we don't fully understand. That's where the notion of a mud flood enters the conversation. It's not simply about mud or disasters. It's about the possibility that parts of our past might be tucked away under layers of soil that arrived all at once instead of accumulating slowly over generations. But before we drift any deeper into lost structures and sunken places, it's worth taking a moment to feel the ground in a more literal way. The soil beneath cities and towns isn't static. It grows, shifts, compacts, erodes, and rebuilds itself. Streets rise over time as buildings are, reconstructed as debris fills in the old paths, as foundations settle. Archaeologists working in ancient cities often find layer after layer of older streets beneath the current one. Rome, for example, rests on centuries of Rome. Istanbul sits on Istanbul. Cities grow upward as much as outward. So when someone notices a building entrance sitting below the present sidewalk, it doesn't necessarily mean that anything catastrophic happened. Sometimes it's just the slow accumulation of life. But the mud flood idea doesn't deal in slow change. It suggests something abrupt, a moment when Earth itself acted more like a wave than a patient sculptor. And there is something undeniably gripping about imagining a moment in the far past when the world might have shifted dramatically. Humans are used to storms and floods and quakes. We know that nature occasionally reminds us that we're living on a planet that doesn't always feel steady. A sudden deluge of mud is not out of the realm of possibility. Massive landslides happen. Volcanic eruptions send rivers of molten earth over entire regions. Earthquakes can liquefy soil and create walls of rushing debris. These things occur in the natural world. But the thought that such an event may have been enormous enough to cover entire civilizations and hide them from memory, leaving only hints for future generations to puzzle over, is something that gently taps the imagination on the shoulder and asks it to consider whether the official pages of history might be missing a chapter or two. The question becomes even more intriguing when you think about how easily stories can fade. Civilizations rise and fall. Some leave behind monuments. Others leave behind little more than pottery fragments or faint foundations buried under centuries of soil. Human lives are brief, and our records, as much as we treasure them, are fragile. Floods wash ink away. Fires erase scrolls. Empires topple and take their libraries with them. So it isn't unreasonable to imagine that there might have been cultures whose memories slipped away long before modern scholars began piecing together the larger story of humanity. That idea sits right at the heart of the mudfall theory, not as a conclusive claim, but as a quiet possibility. What if something happened that altered the surface of the world quickly enough that memories of the people living at the time didn't survive long enough to be written down? It's a thought that invites you to picture enormous walls of earth flowing over landscapes, burying small towns, and perhaps even cities, without giving anyone much time to react. Some survivors might have rebuilt over the top. Others may have moved on, carrying only fragments of memory. Their descendants might have remembered in stories that eventually drifted into myth. And over centuries, those myths might have softened until they sounded like metaphors rather than descriptions of something people once witnessed directly. This is how human memory works. It condenses, simplifies, shifts shape, and eventually leaves us with a patchwork of impressions. But tonight isn't about proving or disproving anything. It's not about choosing a side or deciding whether a mud flood did or didn't happen. It's about settling into the quiet possibility of a forgotten past and allowing your thoughts to drift into the spaces where evidence is thin, where imagination can stretch without pressure, and where the story unfolds, not with certainty, but with gentle curiosity. When you picture old streets lying meters beneath modern ones, or staircases disappearing into the soil, it's easy to let your mind wander into those hidden layers and wonder who walked there before the world grew heavier on top of them. This sense of layered history has always fascinated both scholars and dreamers. You can walk through almost any old city on Earth and see hints of the past peeking through. Maybe it's an uneven foundation. Maybe it's a buried shop front exposed during construction. Maybe it's a cellar that used to be a first floor before the street rose around it. These observations fuel the idea that history is less of a straight line and more of a stack of folded papers, each one resting on the last. And while the mud flood narrative adds an extra twist with its suggestion of rapid and dramatic change, the core curiosity remains the same. What lies beneath the ground we walk on? And how much of the past is still resting there, waiting quietly? As we begin moving into this story, allow yourself to imagine that the Earth is not just a surface, but a kind of memory itself. A memory that settles, rearranges, and occasionally reveals small details when the right moment comes. Old brickwork beneath new plaster, a forgotten staircase uncovered during road repairs, a sealed doorway that opens into a room no one has entered in centuries. These pieces don't answer anything on their own, but together they create a gentle tug that encourages us to look deeper. And as we travel farther into the idea, we'll ease into the reasons people believe a mud flood may have occurred and why others think the explanation is simpler. We'll look at what natural forces are capable of and what patterns of architecture can tell us. And we'll move through all of it at a pace that gives your mind room to settle, to rest, and to let the world fade around the edges. Nothing about this topic requires urgency. It invites patience, attention, and a sense that sometimes the questions we ask are more soothing than the answers. So let's drift a little farther, letting the idea unfold slowly. Because the possibility that ancient civilizations might lie buried in sudden layers of earth isn't just a theory. It's a doorway into wondering how much of human history remains quiet beneath us, waiting for someone curious enough to notice the small, strange clues that have been hiding in plain sight. And as we continue, we'll step gently into the first questions that arise. When people begin exploring this mystery, allowing the thought to settle without reaching any firm conclusion, simply following it wherever it leads next. When people first hear the suggestion that something unusual might be hidden beneath familiar streets and foundations, the idea tends to arrive softly, almost like a rumor that doesn't want to draw too much attention to itself. It doesn't announce anything dramatic. It simply lingers in the mind, the way a passing comment sometimes does when it unexpectedly fits into too many small observations you've made without meaning to. Maybe you've noticed an old building with windows sunk deep below the ground. Maybe you've walked by a row of storefronts where the entrance dips awkwardly beneath the sidewalk, as if the street decided one day to lift itself higher and forgot to tell the buildings beside it. These things aren't usually enough on their own to prompt big questions. But for many people, they became the earliest hints that something about the world's past might not be as straightforward as it seems. There's something familiar about these buried features, something that feels almost ordinary because they appear in so many places. You can visit towns on different continents and find similar patterns. A doorway that opens into the dirt, a staircase that leads downward when it seems like it should lead up, a lower floor that looks as if it was never meant to be underground at all. It's easy to assume that these details must be the result of renovation or shifting soil, or the kind of gradual urban buildup that's always happening. And often they are. Cities change slowly through countless small steps. But the reason the rumor continues, the reason it keeps resurfacing in conversations in quiet corners of the internet, is that the volume of these observations feels too broad for some people to ignore. It doesn't take much imagination to think there might have been a time when something sudden happened, something that altered entire regions of land and left these features behind. The idea begins gently, not with a claim, but with a question. What if there was an event that covered streets and structures more quickly than anyone expected? And once that question enters the mind, it has a way of hanging there, not demanding belief, but encouraging curiosity. That's how many people first step into the topic. Not through dramatic theories, but through noticing something that simply doesn't line up with the explanations they've been given. You might picture someone walking through an older part of a city for the first time. They're taking in the architecture, admiring stonework or brick patterns, or tracing the shapes of windows that were crafted long before modern tools existed. Then they see a window half buried in the dirt, the top barely visible, the sill pressed against soil that seems out of place. They pause, not because they think it's evidence of anything extraordinary, but because it feels odd. They might keep walking and see another one, then another. Eventually, the sense of strangeness settles in. Not urgent, not alarming, just a quiet recognition that there are features in the everyday world that don't quite match the stories we've been told about how cities develop. This is where the rumor gains gentle footing. It doesn't push, it doesn't insist, it lingers at the edge of awareness. People begin to talk about these unusual elements and share photographs of old structures with sides that seem slightly too deep, entrances resting below current ground level, or streets that appear to sit higher than the original foundations. The more these images circulate, the more the idea grows, nourished by the simple fact that similar patterns show up in places with no obvious connection to each other. And from that point onward, curiosity tends to widen. If so many odd details exist, is it unreasonable to wonder whether they might all be part of a larger story? Human minds are built to look for patterns. We can't help it. When we see several hints pointing in a similar direction, we try to connect them, even if the real explanation turns out to be simple. That's part of what makes this topic so compelling. It straddles the line between the familiar and the uncertain. On one hand, there are practical reasons for buried structures. Soil accumulates, cities rebuild, roads rise. On the other hand, there's the lingering sense that something about these physical traces feels like it hints at a moment when the earth itself may have shifted quickly. And because both possibilities seem plausible, the question remains open in the minds of people who enjoy exploring mysteries. Imagine, for example, an old building with a row of windows near what appears to be the second or third floor. You'd expect those windows to offer a view of the outside world, but instead, they open into compacted earth beneath the street. Someone might assume the lower level was a basement. Another person might think the building once stood on a hillside that changed over time. But then you learn that this pattern appears in dozens of cities on multiple continents. When repeated enough, these details accumulate into something larger than the sum of their parts. And that's when the rumor begins to shift into a more persistent thought. The idea isn't just about odd architecture, though. It often expands to include stories about artifacts discovered deeper than expected. Workers repairing a road might uncover tools or pottery far beneath where anyone thought people once lived. Construction teams sometimes find walls or pathways that belong to older versions of the city. Versions that were built at depths that don't quite match the official historical layers. In most cases, archaeologists and historians can explain these findings through established timelines, but the average person encountering them might feel that the explanations don't fully close the gap. And wherever gaps remain, speculation tends to seep in. That speculation isn't necessarily harmful. For many people, it's simply a way of exploring parts of the past that feel mysterious or poorly understood. The thought that civilizations could have existed, flourished, and then been buried under sudden layers of earth has a certain appeal. It invites people to imagine what daily life might have looked like for those who lived before such an event. They picture families building homes, merchants opening shops, children running along streets that have long since disappeared beneath layers of soil. And then, without warning, the world changes. Earth fills the streets. Buildings are buried up to their upper floors. Some structures remain partially visible, others vanish entirely. This mental picture is neither proven nor entirely dismissible. It exists in a strange middle space where logic and imagination interact. Geological events capable of producing sudden earth movements certainly exist. Massive landslides have buried entire towns in minutes. Certain volcanic eruptions can send mud, ash, and debris rushing across landscapes faster than people can react. Rivers can shift course during storms and carry enough sediment to transform the terrain overnight. These things are documented. And so, when someone encounters the mud flood theory for the first time, the thought that something similar could have happened long ago doesn't feel impossible. Even so, the room persists, not because of geological data, but because of how everyday structures look. People tend to trust what they can see. When someone walks past a building with a first floor buried beneath dirt, they don't immediately think of long-term urban development. They think of something sudden, because visually, it resembles something sudden. The mind gravitates toward the explanation that matches the appearance, even if slower processes might be responsible. This is why the idea spreads quietly. It appeals to basic visual reasoning and to the sense that the past might hold more surprises than textbooks usually mention. As more people notice these buried features, conversations grow. Some share personal observations from their own towns. Others bring up old photographs that show buildings partially submerged in earth during earlier decades. And even though many of these examples have reasonable explanations, the sheer number of them fosters a gentle suspicion that something bigger might lie beneath the surface. People begin collecting these examples not necessarily to prove anything, but to gather clues the way someone might gather stones from a riverbank simply because each one feels interesting and slightly out of place. What makes this rumor different from many others is that it doesn't rely on extraordinary claims. It doesn't suggest the impossible. It simply asks whether the ground level may have changed more quickly at some point in the past than the usual models account for. And because that question is small, approachable, and grounded in real physical details, it continues to find listeners. Not everyone accepts it, of course. Many dismiss it immediately. But those who don't often describe the moment of first engaging with the idea as less of a debate and more of a quiet curiosity. They didn't go looking for mysteries. They just noticed something that didn't quite match their expectations. That's the essence of what lies beneath this initial stage of the topic. A soft question resting just below the louder conversations about history, geology, and architecture. A question that begins with ordinary observations and expands into larger possibilities. And because it begins gently, it tends to stay with people. They keep thinking about those buried windows, those sunken doorways, those streets that seem higher than they should be. They picture what the building must have looked like when it was new, how the street might have aligned with the entrance, how the people living there would have moved through their world before the ground rose or the earth shifted. As thoughts like these settle in, people often find themselves wanting to understand more, not to confirm anything grand, but to follow the thread that started tugging at their attention. They begin to wonder how soil builds up, how cities evolve, whether natural events could account for sudden changes, and whether the buried features they've seen represent normal processes or something unusual. Once those questions appear, they tend to lead naturally into deeper parts of the discussion, opening the way toward exploring broader geological possibilities, architectural patterns, and the reasons these traces seem to occur in so many places. And so the quiet rumor beneath our feet continues, not because it demands belief, but because it encourages people to keep looking, to keep noticing, to keep asking why certain details appear the way they do. It invites them to consider the layers of history beneath them and to imagine what might still be resting there, waiting to be uncovered or understood. When you start imagining that the places you walk every day might be resting above something older, something concealed by layers of earth, the world takes on a different feeling. Streets stop being simple surfaces and begin to resemble lids. Foundations feel less like the beginning of a structure and more like the top of something deeper. Even a patch of ground in a quiet neighborhood can seem like a sealed doorway to another time. A time that may not appear in the history books lined neatly on library shelves. This shift doesn't happen abruptly. It unfolds gradually, often beginning with a simple realization that what meets the eye today might be only a small portion of what once existed. And the thought that civilizations may lie beneath layers of soil adds a layer of quiet fascination to the most ordinary corners of the world. Many people have stood in front of an old building and felt a slight sense of disorientation when they noticed that the part touching the ground doesn't look like a beginning. Instead of a main entrance sitting comfortably at street level, they see a set of steps leading down into a shadowed doorway, or perhaps a row of window frames pressed directly against earth that looks as though it crept upward long after the builders finished their work. These details make the mind stretch slightly, as if it's trying to reconstruct what the building must have looked like before the ground enclosed parts of it. This act of mentally lifting the structure back to its original state is what starts people thinking about buried worlds, even if they don't use that phrase. Once you entertain the idea that the ground level may have shifted dramatically at some point, the world opens up in unexpected ways. You begin to picture entire streets that might lie beneath the present ones. The lower floors of shops and homes still intact, but hidden from view. The idea can feel both unsettling and strangely comforting. Unsettling because thinking about buried cities reminds you that landscapes can change in ways humans cannot always control. Comforting because it suggests that the traces of older lives remain preserved, tucked safely under soil that protected them from weather and time. In places where excavations occur for new buildings, people sometimes catch a glimpse of these hidden layers. A foundation trench reveals an old stone walkway lying several feet below the modern sidewalk. A construction project uncovers brickwork that doesn't match any known architectural period in the region. These discoveries tend to be explained in practical terms. Cities often rebuild on top of earlier versions of themselves. Streets rise due to centuries of accumulated debris, repairs, and gradual urban development. But to someone encountering these hidden structures for the first time, the experience can feel like stepping into a different era without ever leaving the present moment. It's as though the ground has quietly been holding on to these memories, waiting for a moment when the world above becomes curious enough to look downward. People who explore old buildings often describe a feeling of walking through a puzzle. They see arches that now sit partially underground, steps that once led to a grand entrance now disappearing into soil, or walls that appear far taller than the visible story suggests. When they imagine the building in its original form, the picture is radically different. Rooms that are now dim basement or storage spaces might once have been bright ground floor parlors. The edges of former streets might lie beneath layers of stone and pavement. As more of these hints accumulate, the idea of a hidden world beneath the soil grows stronger. And this doesn't apply only to cities. In rural areas, farmers occasionally uncover old stone paths or foundations while plowing a field. Hikers stumble across half-buried ruins with only the upper sections visible above the earth. Riverbanks reveal remnants of older structures once the water recedes after seasonal flooding. Each of these discoveries influences how people interpret the idea of a buried world. They're not seeking confirmation of anything extraordinary. They're simply interpreting what they see, noting that the landscape seems to hold more than one story at the same time. In some regions, the layers beneath the soil are well documented. Archaeologists carefully map them and piece together the sequence in which each structure or object was placed there. They look for patterns, traces of habitation, and markers that reveal how old a particular layer might be. But even with improper scientific investigation, there are moments when discoveries raise questions that don't fit neatly into expected timelines. A road found beneath another road that shouldn't predate it. A well-preserved room far deeper than the rest of the surrounding settlement. These moments add a whisper of possibility to the idea that the world may hold more secrets than our record books currently acknowledge. As people learn more about these discoveries, they sometimes begin to picture large portions of ancient civilizations resting beneath modern life, not in ruins, but in states of partial preservation. They imagine rooms filled with pottery, tools, or furniture sealed away by earth. They wonder about the people who might have lived there and what their lives looked like. They picture markets and gatherings, homes and workshops, all blanketed by layers of soil that arrived more quickly than one would expect. This mental image is one of the most compelling aspects of the mud flood concept. It doesn't claim that entire continents of unknown civilizations lie miles underground. It simply suggests that parts of the past may be closer to the surface than we realize, hidden in plain sight, preserved by the same earth that erased them from everyday memory. An interesting aspect of this idea is how it alters our sense of scale. When you walk through a city built on multiple layers of earlier versions of itself, you start to think of the world as something vertical rather than horizontal. Instead of stretching outward through space alone, your imagination begins to move downward through time. Each step you take might be resting above rooms or streets or foundations that once formed the center of someone's daily life. Even though these layers may not be deeply buried, the thought that they exist so close beneath the present makes time feel almost physical, like a series of stacked surfaces you haven't been invited to explore. Some people describe this feeling as a kind of expanded awareness, not in a spiritual or mystical way, but in a simple practical sense. Once you know that cities often rest on earlier versions of themselves, you start to understand that the visible world is only one layer of a much larger whole. This isn't a belief, it's a change in perspective. When a building has windows under the soil, those windows are reminders that the soil wasn't always there. When a street sits higher than the doorways of older structures, it suggests that the surface used to be lower. These observations encourage people to imagine what the world looked like before the ground rose, before layers of earth settled into their current place. And of course, once these thoughts begin, people naturally start asking what might have caused such changes. Was it slow, gradual buildup over centuries? Was it a series of smaller events that led to accumulation? Or was there something sudden, something that acted quickly enough to bury parts of the world in a way that left structures intact but hidden? This question doesn't need a firm answer to be interesting. It simply opens a door to thinking about what the Earth is capable of. Mudslides, landslides, and flooding events are well known to reshape landscapes rapidly. A single storm can move enormous amounts of soil. A river can shift course and deposit sediment several feet deep in hours. While these events are usually confined to specific areas, the idea that something much larger might have happened long ago isn't beyond possibility. It becomes a matter of exploring how much change the Earth can produce, and whether the traces of such a moment might still be visible today in the buried portions of older structures. The concept of a hidden world beneath the soil also invites people to think about how fragile historical records can be. If an event buried part of a civilization, the people living afterward might not have had the resources to preserve detailed accounts. They may have focused on rebuilding instead of documenting. Or perhaps the written records existed, but later disasters destroyed them. Human history is full of fires, floods, and conflicts that erased documents and left entire periods poorly understood. In this way, the buried remnants of buildings, roads, and artifacts sometimes feel like the only surviving voices of forgotten eras. They're quiet, but they're present, holding on to shapes and materials, even when words and stories have vanished. This idea creates a sense of respect for the places beneath our feet. You begin to realize that the ground might be carrying memories that humans no longer have the means to recount. And even if those memories are incomplete, they're tangible, built into the very structure of the world we live on today. Thinking about these hidden layers doesn't lead to a single conclusion. It simply broadens the way people consider the passage of time. Instead of picturing history as a neat timeline, they start to see it as something much more physical, something that accumulates like sediment, leaving behind traces in whatever form the world allows. Buildings sinking into soil, streets rising above old entrances, and artifacts discovered deeper than expected become part of a broader reflection on how the world records its past. As this perspective settles in, people often become more attentive to the ground beneath them. They notice details they would have overlooked before. They pause at lower windows and ask why they exist. They observe the height of older doorways and imagine what the original street level must have been. And slowly, this awareness leads them into deeper curiosity about what might lie beneath the surface, not in a fantastical sense, but in a grounded, practical way that respects the complexity of both human history and the Earth itself. When people begin to imagine the possibility that entire cities might have been overtaken in a single night of mud, the mind almost immediately tries to push back. It feels too sudden, too dramatic, too sweeping to fit within the slow, methodical movement we usually associate with geological change. But the idea doesn't persist because it's dramatic. It persists because the world has demonstrated many times that landscapes can transform far faster than humans expect. Once you start thinking about that, the notion of sudden burial stops feeling like the stuff of legends and starts becoming something that sits quietly within the realm of possibility, even if the full scale of it remains uncertain. It helps to begin by remembering that cities, especially ancient ones, were not protected by modern engineering. They didn't have drainage systems capable of redirecting huge amounts of water and sediment. They didn't have reinforced barriers or elevated foundations designed with future disasters in mind. Many were built close to rivers, lakes, and other sources of water that could be both essential and dangerous. Entire populations placed their homes and markets in areas where a sudden shift in weather, a landslide, or a volcanic event could reshape the terrain in hours. When you picture cities like this built with materials that the Earth could easily reclaim, the idea of them being swallowed becomes less far-fetched. Historical records already show examples of towns that disappeared almost overnight due to mudslides or volcanic flows. There are communities in mountainous regions where a single rainfall transformed the landscape so thoroughly that homes, fields, and even roads vanished beneath several meters of debris. In some cases, only rooftops or upper walls remain visible. These events are typically remembered by the people who lived through them, but the stories often fade over generations, replaced by new towns or absorbed into folklore. Looking at these real-world examples makes it easier to entertain the possibility that something similar could have happened on a larger scale in the distant past, long before written records were widely kept. When people talk about cities lost to mud, they often imagine a single catastrophic moment, a night when the earth shifted violently, sending waves of soil sweeping through streets faster than people could react. If you close your eyes and picture such an event, you might see houses sinking. As the mud rises against their walls, doorways swallowed before residents have time to escape, and entire sections of a settlement disappearing under the weight of moving earth. But the reality of rapid burial doesn't always follow such dramatic imagery. Sometimes the process begins quietly, with heavy rain loosening soil on hillsides, rivers overflowing, or seismic activity destabilizing the ground beneath a city. A settlement positioned at the base of a mountain, or along the path of a river in flood, might face a sudden rush of earth and water without any warning. Residents could wake to the sound of rumbling ground, look outside and see their streets already blocked by mud. In such a scenario, survival might depend on reaching higher ground quickly, leaving behind homes and possessions. When the event ended, those who returned may have found that entire sections of their town were gone, not in ruins, but simply hidden beneath a thick layer of soil. They might not have had the resources to dig it out. Over time, people may have rebuilt on higher, safer ground, leaving the buried city untouched, a quiet testament to the event that overtook it. Not all examples would have required dramatic geological activity. Long-term saturation of soil can cause liquefaction, a process in which ground temporarily behaves like a liquid, allowing buildings to sink. If this occurs during an earthquake or intense rainfall, the effects can be unexpectedly swift. Structures that once sat securely on solid ground may suddenly shift or sink into the earth, disappearing beneath the surface. In a city constructed largely from brick or stone without deep foundations, this kind of sudden descent could lead to entire blocks dropping below the natural grade. People who witnessed such an event might have survived but been unable to salvage the buried portions. If the area was later abandoned or altered by further natural changes, the buried structures might have remained sealed away, waiting to be rediscovered centuries later. Many ancient cities were also situated near river deltas, where soil deposits accumulate quickly. In times of intense flooding, rivers can change course, carrying enormous volumes of sediment. A flood heavy enough could deposit several feet of mud across a wide area. If buildings were left standing, but partially submerged, and if subsequent floods brought more deposits, it wouldn't take long before most of a settlement was hidden. This doesn't require a single dramatic event, only a sequence of heavy storms in a region already prone to seasonal flooding. Yet people living through it, the transformation could appear sudden, especially if they had no prior experience with such conditions. When modern observers encounter buildings whose lower floors sit beneath present soil levels, they sometimes imagine a single, overwhelming event. But the reality might involve multiple layers of deposition occurring over a short period. For example, consider a region that experiences back-to-back storms. The first storm floods the land with water and loose sediment. The second storm, arriving before the ground is settled, pushes additional soil onto the weakened landscape. The combined effect could easily create a burial scenario that appears sudden and complete. Residents may have fled the area after the first event, leaving their homes vulnerable to being overtaken. When they returned, if they returned at all, they might have found that the structures were no longer salvageable. Even in the absence of written accounts, physical evidence can hint at such rapid transformations. Archaeologists sometimes find rooms that appear perfectly preserved beneath layers of soil with walls intact and floors undisturbed. The presence of artifacts left exactly where they were used suggests that people did not have time to clear the space before it was buried. Although scientists usually attribute these cases to volcanic ash or river deposition, the same appearance could result from a sudden mud flow or soil collapse. This raises questions about how many such events might have occurred in the deep past without leaving behind clear indicators of their cause. The possibility that an ancient civilization could disappear in a single night of mud often feels dramatic because we tend to imagine civilizations as large, powerful entities with the infrastructure to withstand natural disasters. But many early settlements were small, fragile, and positioned in vulnerable locations because those locations offered water, trade opportunities, or fertile soil. A single event could be enough to overwhelm them. And if the people who lived there didn't have a robust writing system or didn't survive in large enough numbers to record the event, the memory of that night could vanish almost as quickly as the city itself. Once you consider how fragile human memory can be, the disappearance of such records becomes easier to understand. Oral traditions may attempt to preserve the story, but over generations, these stories might evolve, shift, or simplify. The event might turn into a cautionary tale, a myth about the Earth's anger, or a legend about a city swallowed because its people angered the gods. Long after the original meaning has faded, the physical evidence might still lie beneath the soil. People walking above it may have no idea what rests below the surface. The idea of cities lost in a single night of mud also leads people to question how many such events might have gone unnoticed or unrecorded. If we accept that large-scale natural disasters occurred long before detailed documentation existed, then the idea that entire settlements could have vanished without leaving behind written testimony doesn't feel impossible. Instead, it feels like a natural extension of the gaps already present in the historical record. Human history is filled with unknowns. We have fragments of pottery, sections of walls, and scattered clues that hint at civilizations whose full stories we may never recover. The mudful idea simply adds another layer to this uncertainty, suggesting that some of these gaps may be the direct result of sudden burial events. Thinking about such possibilities can change the way people interpret archaeological discoveries. When a team of researchers excavates a site and finds well-preserved lower floors beneath compacted soil, they often interpret the layers through established frameworks of gradual deposition. But someone familiar with the idea of sudden mud burial might wonder whether the layers accumulated more rapidly than the standard model suggests. This doesn't require rejecting scientific explanations. It simply expands the range of possibilities people consider when trying to understand how ancient sites came to be arranged the way they are. As these thoughts develop, the mind begins to picture the scale of such events. It imagines the movement of Earth, the speed of the flow, the sound of shifting landscapes. But it also considers the aftermath. A city buried overnight would leave behind survivors who had to make quick decisions about their future. Some might attempt to uncover parts of their old homes. Others might abandon the region entirely, moving to safer ground and leaving the buried structures untouched. Over time, vegetation might grow over the soil, further concealing the evidence. Animals might roam across the area, unaware of the city below. Centuries later, new settlements might be built on top of the land, with no knowledge of what lies beneath. All of this contributes to the idea that the world we see today represents only the most recent layer of a much deeper story. Cities lost in a single night of mud are not just thought experiments. They are reminders of how vulnerable human structures can be to natural forces. They emphasize the difference between the permanence we imagine in our buildings and the impermanence the earth enforces. They invite us to think not only about how civilizations grow, but also about how quickly they can be transformed or erased. This perspective doesn't claim that every buried structure in the world is the result of a single catastrophic event. It doesn't suggest that entire continents were covered in mud overnight. Instead, it simply encourages people to imagine that some of the buried portions of old buildings, some of the odd architectural traces, and some of the discrepancies in ground levels may represent moments when the Earth acted more quickly than the slow passage of time normally allows. Many people when they first walk into an older part of a city or pass along a street lined with buildings from centuries past, aren't necessarily searching for anything unusual. They might admire the craftsmanship, the worn stone, or the fading paint, but they aren't expecting the architecture itself to raise questions. Yet, the moment someone begins paying closer attention to how certain structures are arranged, where windows sit, how entrances are placed, and what portions of the building appear strangely out of alignment with the land around them, an entirely different picture begins to emerge. It starts quietly with an observation that doesn't quite match expectations, and before long, the architecture itself becomes a kind of puzzle that seems to challenge the traditional explanations for why it exists the way it does. Consider the experience of standing in front of an old building whose lower windows appear half-buried. You might chalk it up to soil accumulation or changes in street level. But then you notice the shape of the window frames. The detailing suggests they were meant to be seen, not hidden. Decorative flourishes adorn the edges. The openings are symmetrical and proportioned, like the windows higher up. Everything about them indicates they belong to a floor that was once part of the public face of the building, not an underground basement. When you realize this, the building stops being a simple structure and starts becoming a clue to a larger mystery. People have documented such features across numerous cities. They point out grand arches, positioned below ground level, doorways that now lead into compacted soil, staircases that descend when they should logically ascend, and rooms that appear to have been designed as living spaces, but now sit buried in darkness. None of these features necessarily prove anything by themselves, but collectively they force a person to rethink what a building is supposed to look like if nothing unusual happened to it. Some observers describe the architecture as oddly oversized for what appears above ground. They notice that columns continue far below the current surface, as though the visible portion represents only the top half of what was intended. Others point out that window spacing suggests a missing level. When a row of windows sits too close to the foundation, yet another row exists directly above them. The proportions feel off across multiple structures. This pattern repeats. It gives the impression that entire floors have been submerged, leaving only the upper sections exposed. These architectural puzzles invite questions because they challenge our usual understanding of how ancient and historic buildings were constructed. If a structure was always meant to have only the floors that appear visible today, why do so many decorative elements exist beneath the soil? Why would builders waste time embellishing areas no one would ever see? Why would doorways be placed below ground level if the ground was already at its present height when the building was constructed? These are the kinds of questions that spark curiosity in people exploring the mud flood discussion. Architects and historians often provide explanations. They discuss shifting ground, urban buildup, and changes in infrastructure. Streets are raised to improve drainage. Cities expand upward as they rebuild after fires or floods. Over centuries, debris accumulates. These factors absolutely play substantial roles in changing the elevation of city streets. But what keeps people fascinated is that the architectural details don't just hint at minor changes. They often look like they were part of a functional design intended for a ground level that no longer exists. Imagine a building with a doorway that sits several feet below the sidewalk. You look at the door, and see that it was crafted with the same care as the others above it. The lintel is decorated. The handle is ornate. The proportions are elegant. It doesn't resemble a basement entrance added later. It looks like a primary entrance. And once someone sees a building like this, they usually start finding others. In some cities, entire blocks show the same pattern, creating the sense that the present ground level does not match the original intent of the architecture. Another detail that captures people's attention is the presence of barricaded windows. These windows often sit partially or fully below ground and appeared to have been sealed long after the building was completed. The shape of the window frame suggests it was originally open to the outside. The decorative trim supports that idea, and the brick and fill rarely matches the surrounding walls. This mismatch implies that the sealing occurred later, when the window no longer served its purpose, because the ground had risen to its height. When these sealed windows appear, in building after building, they begin to resemble a widespread adaptation rather than isolated renovations. Some structures even show evidence of ventilation, grates at levels where air would only flow if the surrounding ground had been lower. These grates often lead into rooms that appear too refined to be storage areas. People examining such buildings wonder whether these were once ground floor spaces that became underground through forces not fully accounted for. The puzzle deepens when these architectural features align across multiple buildings in the same area, suggesting a collective shift rather than isolated changes in individual properties. One of the most striking examples people point to involves buildings with what appear to be multiple first floors. The visible ground floor has its doorways and windows, but beneath that floor lies another set of similar features, partially buried. The presence of two layers of ground-level architecture stacked on top of each other suggests an abrupt change in elevation rather than a slow accumulation. If the change had been gradual, people would have adjusted their structures over time, building new features that reflected the new surface levels. But many of these buildings appear to have been adapted after the fact, as if the ground level rose faster than expected, forcing residents to modify entrances and seal off lower floors. In regions prone to mudslides or volcanic activity, this sort of sudden burial is not unheard of. Entire towns have been swallowed by mud in hours. Some historic structures in these areas display architectural oddities, similar to those discussed in the mudflation. This connection doesn't prove anything on a global scale, but it does reinforce the idea that the Earth is capable of rapid shifts that can alter the face of cities in ways that align with the puzzle seen in many historic structures. People investigating these anomalies also examine interior layouts. They point out rooms whose dimensions and features indicate they were not designed as basement. Fireplaces sit too low. Window placements make no sense for subterranean spaces. Staircases lead downward in ways that feel inconsistent with original design intentions. When these interior features align with buried exterior elements, the idea of a missing ground level becomes more compelling. Some buildings contain lower floors with ornate molding, plasterwork, or ornamentation that would be unnecessary for utilitarian spaces. These details suggest the rooms were meant to be lived in, not hidden. When such spaces are now buried, it raises the question of what event or series of events caused the ground to rise around them. And while many scholars attribute this to long-term changes in urban infrastructure. People exploring alternative possibilities argued that the scale and uniformity seen in certain locations indicate something more sudden. Another aspect that captures attention involves the symmetry of old buildings. Historic architects often designed structures with precise proportions, ensuring that windows, doorways, and decorative elements lined up in coherent patterns. When modern observers see that a building's lower portion no longer aligns with the current terrain, it becomes obvious that the symmetry was disrupted by external forces. A doorway that once matched the elevation of a street might now sit several feet below it. A row of windows originally intended for public viewing may now lie concealed by earth. These shifts prompt people to imagine what the building looked like before its proportions were obscured. Different cities show different patterns, but the overall theme remains consistent. Buried architectural features appear across wide geographical areas, leading some to wonder whether a single era experienced widespread ground-level changes. This doesn't necessarily imply a global event. It might reflect regional disasters or coincidental similarities in how cities evolved. But when dozens of cities across continents display the same types of architectural puzzles, curiosity deepens. People start asking why so many structures appear to have been built for a world where the ground sat several feet lower. Some observers focus on specific architectural styles. They notice that certain buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries appear especially prone to these puzzling features. They point out structures with large, imposing facades that extend deep into the ground. The visible portion seems incomplete, as though the true base of the building lies hidden. They wonder whether architects of the timed designed buildings in anticipation of ground-level changes, or whether the changes occurred later, altering the original appearance. These kinds of questions illustrate how architecture becomes a gateway into deeper reflections about history and geology. People also examine photographic evidence from earlier periods. Old photographs sometimes show buildings already partially buried long before modern construction projects raised the streets. These images raise questions about when the burial occurred and why. If the structures were already sunk a century ago, but were built only decades earlier, then something must have changed in that relatively short time. The photographs themselves don't answer the question, but they reinforce the idea that the ground level shifts happened quickly. The puzzle extends into our understanding of how communities respond to sudden geological changes. If an event buried part of a city, the residents might have adapted by building new entrances on what became the upper floor. They might have sealed lower windows and constructed new pathways at the new elevation. Over time, the original ground level would become a memory, replaced by the higher one. As generations passed, the buried sections would be forgotten or misunderstood. And when historians later examine the structures, they might attribute the anomalies to gradual street raising rather than a single event. Even small architectural details can carry significance. A handrail that begins too low, a threshold that doesn't align with the current floor, or a foundation that extends farther downward than necessary all raise questions. When such details appear across many buildings in one area, they create patterns that feel too coordinated to be accidental. These patterns may represent the legacy of an event that reshaped the landscape and forced residents to reshape their architecture to match the new reality. Ultimately, the puzzling architecture that shouldn't exist becomes one of the strongest visual threads in the mud flood conversation. It provides tangible physical clues that prompt people to imagine what may have happened to the cities they live in or visit. It encourages them to picture the world as something dynamic rather than fixed. A place where even the structures built by human hands are vulnerable to changes in the earth. When people begin looking past buildings and start paying attention to the earth around them, the mystery often deepens in an unexpected way. The soil itself becomes part of the puzzle. It doesn't behave the way many imagine it should. Instead of forming neat, predictable layers that build steadily over long periods of time, the ground in many regions shows sharp transitions, abrupt breaks, and thicknesses that don't match the known history of the cities resting above them. These irregularities aren't immediately obvious to the casual passerby, but once someone learns to notice them, they can't help but see them almost everywhere. It's as though the earth carries a story that doesn't quite line up with the version found in documents or textbooks. And the only way to understand that story is to pay close attention to the layers beneath our feet. In many urban areas, digging even a modest distance into the ground can reveal transitions between soil types that look strangely sudden. You might expect the layers to show a slow shift from one composition to another, representing centuries of accumulated sediments. Instead, workers sometimes find sharply defined boundaries, separating compacted earth from finer material, or clay sitting directly on top of layers that should have taken far longer to accumulate naturally. These abrupt changes make people wonder what kind of event could have created such distinct divisions in such a short amount of time. While geologists have explanations for many of these anomalies, the visual effect can still feel jarring, especially for someone who has been observing buried architecture and is already thinking about how the ground level may have shifted suddenly in the past. One of the strangest things people notice is that in some places the soil seems far deeper than what the recorded history of the city would suggest. If a settlement is only a few hundred years old, finding several meters of sediment above older foundations raises questions. How could so much material accumulate naturally in such a short time? If the earth built up gradually, why do some layers look as though they arrived all at once? These questions become especially interesting when the soil appears unusually uniform across wide areas, as though a single event deposited it rather than a slow process taking place over generations. Sometimes people examining excavation sites find layers of soil that seem too clean or too consistent. Natural sedimentation usually contains a variety of materials, stones, organic matter, small artifacts from daily life. But in some places, the soil lying directly above older structures appears almost pure, lacking the mixed composition expected from gradual accumulation. It looks more like material carried by water or mud, deposited quickly and settling evenly before people had a chance to disturb it. Observers looking at such layers often describe them as too perfect, not because they assume something extraordinary happened, but because they don't match the chaotic, uneven buildup typically seen in long-term urban development. Another feature people comment on is the angle of the soil layers. In many natural settings, layers form horizontally due to sediment settling in place. But in some urban excavation sites, layers appear slanted or folded, as though the soil was pushed rather than gently deposited. When these angles cut across older structures, people begin to consider the possibility that the Earth moved rapidly at some point, altering the original terrain. While natural, geological processes can create slanted layers. The effect becomes more striking when the angles intersect buried buildings in ways that imply the structures were already standing when the soil shifted. One example that often gets discussed involves locations where older streets lie significantly below the modern surface, but the soil between them doesn't show evidence of centuries of human activity. Instead of containing trash, pottery shards, or debris from everyday life, the layers appear almost sterile. This absence makes people wonder whether the material covering the lower streets arrived quickly, leaving no time for gradual accumulation. If the soil had built up slowly over centuries, archaeologists would expect to find evidence of human activity mixed throughout. When those markers are missing, the layers can feel out of place. Of course, geologists offer many explanations for these oddities. They talk about alluvial deposits, river migrations, seasonal flooding, erosion followed by new deposition, and the natural tendency of landscapes to shift and rebuild themselves. These explanations are valid and grounded in scientific research, but people exploring the possibility of rapid burial pay attention to details that seem to fall outside typical examples. They point to soil layers that extend across areas where no known river once flowed, or to deposits that appear uniform across slopes where water should have behaved differently. It's these inconsistencies that make them question whether something other than slow natural change might have shaped the land. Another detail that captures attention involves the thickness of certain soil layers. In many places, soil accumulates at a predictable rate. It builds up slowly through erosion, plant decay, and human activity. But in some excavation sites, people find layers several feet thick that appear to have formed far too quickly based on known historical timelines. When these layers lie directly above the entrances or windows of older buildings, the effect is striking. It suggests that whatever buried those lower floors did so rapidly, not through centuries of gradual deposition. In certain cities, researchers have documented streets built at top older streets, each layer separated by significant soil deposits. If each layer represented a period of rebuilding after gradual accumulation, the thickness of the soil between them should match the expected rate of deposition. Instead, these layers are often far deeper than what the timeline allows. This discrepancy encourages people to consider whether certain layers might have been deposited suddenly by a single event or a series of rapid events. When large-scale excavation projects expose these inconsistencies, the visual evidence can be compelling. For example, when a modern building site reveals a buried staircase leading into what appears to be a fully formed lower floor, people naturally wonder why the ground rose so dramatically above that area. Even if the official explanation attributes the rise to long-term changes, the sharp transition between the original floor level and the overlying soil invites further questions. Why is the layer so thick? Why is it so uniform? Why does it lack the expected signs of gradual habitation? Another factor that intrigues people involves the presence of artifacts at depths that seem inconsistent with their age. Occasionally, items believed to belong to recent centuries are found beneath layers that should predate them. While most of these anomalies can be explained through soil disturbance, construction activity, or misinterpretation. The fact that they occur at all fuels speculation. It suggests that the ground may have changed in ways not fully documented or understood. To someone exploring the mud flood idea, these puzzling soil layers form an important part of the narrative. They aren't looking for proof of anything extraordinary. They're simply noticing patterns that appear unusual and trying to piece them together. When the soil above buried architectural features displays characteristics associated with rapid deposition, the two kinds of evidence begin to support each other. Buried buildings and mismatched soil layers create a combined picture that encourages people to imagine a past in which the ground shifted more dramatically than conventional models suggest. None of this means that geology is wrong, or that alternative explanations are always necessary. Landscapes are complex, and many factors influence how soil accumulates and moves. But the conversation becomes more interesting when people compare what they've been told about the age of certain layers with what they see in excavation sites. If a layer several feet thick appears to have been deposited in a relatively short time, then the question becomes, what event could have done that? This line of thinking leads people to examine the broader environment around historic cities. They look at nearby hills, valleys, and waterways. They consider whether a landslide, river rift, or other natural forces could have deposited the soil. They examine the composition of the sediment to determine whether it resembles material carried by water or mud. Often the soil displays characteristics that don't match any single explanation. It contains a mixture of materials suggesting soil movement rather than slow sedimentation, or it lacks the kind of sorting seen in deposits shaped by water flow. Another aspect involves soil compaction. Layers deposited gradually tend to show different levels of compacting due to the weight of time and the influence of weather. But layers that appear abruptly compressed across a wide area raise questions about how they formed. If the soil above a buried floor is densely packed and consistent across the entire structure, people wonder whether it settled suddenly rather than through slow accumulation. Rapid burial followed by the weight of the new layer could create this effect. Some researchers have also documented soil layers containing broken materials, such as crushed brick, stone fragments, and scattered organic matter that appear to have been mixed together before deposition. This kind of mixture resembles material swept up by floods or mud flows, rather than material laid down over long periods. The presence of such mixed layers near buried architectural features encourages the idea that a sudden forceful event might have contributed. The issue becomes even more compelling when these soil anomalies appear in areas not typically associated with extreme natural disasters. If a hillside prone to landslides displays thick mixed layers, that's expected. But when similar layers appear in regions without steep terrain or large water sources, the question becomes more intriguing. What kind of event could have deposited such material in a place where no known geological forces should have been capable of doing so? People drawn to this topic also point out that many older maps depict ground elevations different from those seen today. Streets appear lower, buildings appear fully exposed. When comparing these maps to the modern landscape, some notice that the ground seems to have risen in ways the records don't fully explain. While maps can be imprecise, the combination of stratigraphic discrepancies and puzzling soil layers adds another piece to the puzzle. As these observations accumulate, the idea of ground layers that refuse to align with expected timelines begins to feel less like an outlier and more like a recurring theme. They prompt people to think about whether the Earth has reshaped itself in ways that left behind physical evidence but not written records. They wonder whether ancient civilizations might have been affected by events that buried their structures before they had the chance to record what happened. Walking through an older part of a city, a person might not expect to be confronted by something as simple yet strangely unsettling as a doorway sitting far below the level of the street. It isn't dramatic at first glance. It isn't hidden by vines or surrounded by ruins. It's just lower than it should be. But that's exactly why it draws attention. A doorway is supposed to welcome someone into a space. It's meant to sit at the level where people walk. When it ends up several feet beneath the ground, half obscured by soil, or blocked by steps that descend awkwardly, something about it prompts the mind to pause. These aren't rare anomalies. They appear in city after city, in old neighborhoods, in commercial districts, in places that have stood for centuries. And once a person notices one such doorway, they start spotting more until the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. A buried doorway suggests a change in elevation, but the scale of that change often looks too steep for the time frame in which the building was constructed. You might see a doorway framed with ornate stonework, clearly crafted with intention and care, placed in a location that makes no sense if the ground was always as high as it is now. Why would a builder place a beautiful entrance several feet underwater in soil? Why would they build steps leading down into darkness? And why do so many old buildings show the same pattern, as though an entire level of the city was quietly submerged? People sometimes assume the buried entrances are simply basement, but that explanation falls apart quickly when you study the details. Most basements have small windows designed to let in a bit of air or light. These buried features aren't small. They're full-size doorways, often with decorative trim and symmetrical placement that indicates they were intended as the building's original main access point. The craftsmanship is consistent with ground F floor architecture, not utilitarian underground storage. Another feature that draws attention is the presence of stairways that don't behave the way stairways usually do. In many old cities, stairs descend from the street to reach these sunken entrances. The stairs sometimes appear added later, built awkwardly to accommodate the new elevation. You might see mismatched stone, uneven steps, and railings that don't blend with the rest of the building. The steps feel like afterthoughts, suggesting that the original entrance was never meant to require them. If anything, they imply that the street rose, not that the building sank. Sunken windows add to the puzzle. They appear beneath the level of the modern sidewalk, half buried in soil with frames and glass that once faced open air. Some of them are sealed, others remain open, but reveal only dirt behind them. When you examine these windows closely, you see decorative elements consistent with windows meant to be seen and used. Nobody embellishes a window that's meant to be hidden underground. The trim, the symmetry, the proportion. These features indicate that the structure originally stood in a different relationship to the ground. People exploring this topic often take photographs of these buried features and compare them across different cities. What stands out is how consistent the architectural patterns seem to be. You don't find just a handful of these sunken doorways. You find dozens, sometimes hundreds, depending on the city. And these aren't obscure, rural locations. They appear in major cities with long histories of urban development. You can walk through a neighborhood built in the 19th century and find that an entire row of buildings shares the same downward-facing entrances and half-buried windows, as if the ground level shifted dramatically after the construction was complete. Some cities have entire blocks where the original street now lies below several modern layers. In some locations, older streets can still be accessed through tunnels, alleyways, or preserved historical sections. These older paths reveal what the city used to look like before the ground rose. When you stand in one of these buried streets, the relationship between doorways, windows, and facades makes perfect sense. Everything is proportioned properly. Everything aligns. But when you return to the modern street above, the same buildings appear strangely unbalanced. The present street level sits too high relative to the architectural design. In certain European cities, such as Edinburgh or Prague, these underground streets are preserved and sometimes open for tours. People who walk through them often describe the sensation of being in a fully functioning city that was simply covered up and replaced. While historians offer clear explanations about fires, reconstruction, and intentional raising of streets, the visual effect remains striking. It's easy to understand how someone encountering these sites without context might wonder whether something more sudden occurred. But not all buried streets have such thorough documentation. In many places, the traces lie scattered, quietly waiting beneath layers of soil. When construction crews dig foundations, they sometimes uncover cobblestone pathways, door frames, or small rooms that clearly belong to earlier versions of the city. These discoveries don't always make the news. Often, they're noted during construction, photographed briefly, then covered again, so the modern building can proceed. Only a handful of people witness them, and those people often walk away with lingering questions about why the city seems to have been built upon itself so many times. One of the most puzzling aspects of sunken streets is how neatly preserved some of the older layers appear. If the ground rose slowly over hundreds of years, the layers should contain debris, artifacts, and gradual transitions. But in some cities, the layers between the older and newer streets show signs of rapid deposition, uniform material, minimal human presence, and compacted soil that appears to have settled quickly. These characteristics resemble the effects of flooding, mud flow, or sudden landscape shifts rather than long-term accumulation. People fascinated by the mud flood idea point to these examples and wonder whether entire streets were buried by a sudden influx of earth. They emphasize how consistent the height difference can be across large areas. In some cases, the buried streets lie 8 to 12 ft below the modern surface. If such depth resulted from slow buildup, the timeline should show corresponding changes. But the historical record in certain regions doesn't mention such extensive elevation shifts within the expected time frame. This gap between physical evidence and documented history leaves room for speculation. It's not just the depth of burial that captures attention, but also the relationships between adjacent buildings. In areas where sunken structures appear, the buildings often share a uniform alignment relative to the buried level. This consistency suggests that the buried grade was once the shared ground level for an entire neighborhood. If the ground rose slowly and unevenly, you'd expect some buildings to adapt differently. Instead, the lower portions often match perfectly, as though they were designed for a now hidden street that once ran openly across the city. People exploring this topic also notice features like lower balconies or decorative stonework, now pressed against soil. These architectural elements would never have been placed underground intentionally. They served aesthetic roles in the original design, meant to face open air and interact with street-level activity. When such elements appear buried, they raise the question of what conditions the builders expected when they carved those details. Another recurring puzzle involves the use of brick vaults and arches underground. Many older buildings have vatted ceilings beneath the modern surface, ceilings that look too refined for basement or storage rooms. They resemble entry halls or living spaces, not utilitarian areas. The craftsmanship indicates they were designed for daily use. Yet today, they sit in darkness, trapped below layers of soil. The mismatch between design and present environment encourages people to wonder what transformed these spaces. Some structures reveal interior walls that were never meant to face Earth. For example, plaster finishes, ornate woodwork, and smooth stone surfaces appear in places that are now underground. These materials weren't designed to endure long-term contact with soil. Their presence suggests that the rooms were once entirely exposed. If those spaces were buried quickly, the materials might survive for centuries, preserved by the lack of air and moisture circulation. The condition of buried structures becomes another clue. Buildings that remain intact beneath several feet of earth often show little sign of gradual decay. Instead, they reveal sharp transitions between preserved surfaces and the soil surrounding them. This preservation resembles the effect seen in volcanic ash deposits or landslide burial, where structures remain sealed in their final state. While this doesn't prove anything, it serves as a point of curiosity for people trying to understand how the lower portions of buildings became entombed. When photographs of buried entrances and sunken streets circulate online, they prompt a wide range of reactions. Some people dismiss them as normal results of urban development. Others feel intrigued, wondering why so many examples look so similar despite appearing in cities with very different histories. The photographs often show doorways several feet below the sidewalk, windows half filled with soil, or people walking past entrances that appear to lead into the earth rather than into buildings. These images stick with people not because they prove anything, but because they challenge expectations. Street-level changes usually involve clear historical documentation. Cities raise streets to improve drainage or prevent flooding. They rebuild after fires or restructure infrastructure. When these changes happen gradually, they appear in maps, municipal records, and engineering notes. But in some cases, the records either don't exist or don't address the specific elevation differences visible today. That gap between the physical evidence and the written record deepens the mystery. It suggests that something happened, but the details were lost or never fully recorded. People also investigate the way foundations are constructed. Many assume that older buildings were built shallowly, causing them to sink. However, some buried structures show foundations extending deeper than expected, indicating that they were stable and intentionally designed that way. If the foundations were sound, then the ground rising around them becomes a more plausible explanation than the building settling downward. In regions with documented natural disasters, such as volcanic eruptions, mud flows, or landslides, buried features make sense. But when the same types of features appear in regions without such geological activity, people begin asking whether something else occurred. They point out that sunken doorways exist in flat areas, plains, and places with no history of intense natural events. If the ground rose dramatically in these regions, what caused it? Some researchers propose that repeated flooding could deposit layers of sediment in certain areas. Others suggest that changes in water tables or long-term subsidence might explain the elevation shifts. While these explanations may account for specific sites, they don't always address the widespread patterns seen across multiple cities. That discrepancy fuels further curiosity. When people examine buried streets, they sometimes discover infrastructure elements that appear out of place. For example, they might find water channels, drainage systems, or small courtyards positioned several feet below modern grade, features that were clearly meant to function at ground level. These discoveries imply that the buried level once acted as the main surface. If it had always been a basement level, the design would reflect that purpose. Instead, the structures align with ordinary street-level architecture. As people study these features more deeply, they realize that the buried layers sometimes contain doorways connecting directly to other buildings or interior courtyards. This confirms that the buried level once served as a functional part of the city. The interconnected nature of these spaces suggests a coherent urban design rather than isolated anomalies. The more someone observes these sunken neighborhoods, the easier it becomes to imagine an earlier city resting comfortably at a lower elevation before something raised the land above it. The buried doorways, the sunken windows, the partially exposed facades, all of them feel like remnants of a world displaced by an event no longer remembered. This line of thinking naturally leads to bigger questions. If entire sections of cities were buried, how widespread was this phenomenon? Did it occur in isolated regions or across continents? And if the ground shifted so dramatically, what became of the people who lived there? Every so often, when someone studies the artifacts left behind by ancient people, a strange pattern emerges. The objects themselves sometimes feel more familiar than the cultures that created them. A tool might be carefully carved, shaped with skill, or crafted from materials that required knowledge far beyond what we typically imagine for a particular era. Yet the name of the people who made it, the language they spoke, and the stories they told have all faded into silence. This imbalance between what survived and what vanished invites people to imagine that the world once held civilizations capable of shaping their environment in ways we still don't fully understand, and that these civilizations may have been altered, displaced, or even buried by events now hidden beneath layers of soil. Across different regions, archaeologists occasionally discover tools, implements, or fragments of technology that don't match the cultural level associated with the layers in which they were found. This doesn't mean they belong to impossibly advanced cultures or that they defy all explanation. But the mismatch raises questions about how certain artifacts ended up in places that don't align neatly with known timelines. Sometimes the artifacts appear older than the layers around them. Other times, they seem far more refined than one would expect from the surrounding context. These inconsistencies don't necessarily rewrite history on their own, but they create small cracks in the accepted narrative. Cracks that make people pause and wonder what chapters might be missing. Many people picture ancient civilizations as simple, limited in their abilities, and focus primarily on survival. But some artifacts reveal craftsmanship that suggests a deep understanding of materials, engineering principles, or symbolic design. When these objects outlive the cultures that produced them, they become the last remaining representatives of people whose stories didn't survive long enough to be recorded. A beautifully shaped stone tool, a precisely measured piece of ceramic, or a metal object forged with unexpected skill, all hint at worlds that have slipped through the cracks of documented history. One example often discussed involves tools found at depths that conflict with the expected age of the surrounding soil. If the soil layers built up slowly and consistently, the tools at a particular depth should match a particular era. But in some excavation sites, researchers find objects that seem more developed or sophisticated than the layers imply. The question becomes whether the soil moved rapidly at some point, bearing materials from different periods together, or whether parts of the landscape shifted, carrying artifacts downward in ways that haven't been fully accounted for. People exploring the of buried civilizations often focus on these mismatches because they support the possibility that rapid burial events may have concealed larger portions of the past. If soil layers were disrupted suddenly by a mud flow, landslide, or similar event, artifacts from the surface could be forced downward and preserved beneath layers that formed almost instantly. When those layers are later interpreted using a gradual model, the artifacts appear older or more out of place than they actually are. This creates confusion, not because the objects defy explanation, but because the layers no longer reflect the sequence in which events occurred. Another area of interest involves remnants of structures or tools found in places where no known civilization of matching sophistication was believed to exist. In some cases, the objects are simple but unexpectedly refined. A symmetrical blade, a bead drilled with exceptional precision, a pottery shard, bearing patterns that look more advanced than the surrounding cultural debris suggests. These items don't point directly to lost civilizations, but they offer glimpses of cultural achievements that may not have been fully documented or preserved. People interpret them as hints of societies whose identities faded before historians had the chance to record them. Sometimes a single tool can capture the imagination. A well-balanced stone axe found deep beneath the surface might display a level of craftsmanship requiring specialized skill. A metal object found in what should be a pre-metal layer might raise questions about how widespread certain technologies truly were. Even small objects like needles, clamps, or decorative pins can suggest the presence of traditions or techniques that outlived the cultures that mastered them. Over time, as more examples accumulate, they form a pattern that suggests the past may have held more complexity than modern narratives reflect. People studying buried architecture often connect these artifact puzzles with the physical evidence of buried streets and doorways. They wonder whether the same forces that lowered building levels beneath modern soil might also have preserved tools and everyday items belonging to people who lived in those earlier environments. If a city or settlement was buried rapidly, The objects used by its inhabitants might remain sealed in place, protected from erosion or disturbance. These preserved items, when later discovered, would appear unusually fresh or unusual for their depth, contributing to the sense that the layers don't align properly with the history they're supposed to represent. There are also accounts of tools or objects discovered during construction projects that were never properly studied because they didn't fit expected categories. Workers might uncover a shaped stone or crafted metal piece and simply discard it, unaware of its significance. In other cases, items are reported but not cataloged in detail. The cumulative effect of these losses is that the archaeological record becomes patchier than we might hope. The gaps leave room for speculation about what kinds of civilizations may have existed and how their tools survived when their identities did not. In some regions, oral traditions describe earlier peoples whose names were forgotten, even to those telling the stories. These tales might mention builders who raised structures no one could replicate, artisans famed for their skill, or groups known only through the ruins they left behind. While such stories don't constitute evidence, they echo the idea that civilizations existed before the ones we associate with particular regions, and that those civilizations may have vanished abruptly or over time, leaving behind tools and structures as their only surviving markers. Another angle people consider involves the quality of certain artifacts. When examined closely, some tools display precision that requires careful shaping, consistent techniques, and generations of passed down knowledge. This suggests that the cultures producing them had established craft traditions. Yet the names of these cultures, their languages, and their stories have all disappeared. Where the tools remain, the identities do not. This disconnect makes people wonder whether these cultures were wiped out by sudden environmental changes or absorbed into other groups without leaving behind clear written accounts. The presence of anomalous artifacts in floodplains, valleys, or regions prone to soil movement also supports the possibility that burial events may have preserved items from civilizations whose existence wasn't otherwise recorded. When sediment covers a settlement quickly, tools and possessions might remain intact. Later researchers might discover them far deeper than expected and attribute their depth to age instead of sudden burial. The timeline becomes distorted, and the civilization that used the objects becomes more difficult to identify. Patterns like these appear not only in tools, but in construction techniques. Some older structures display stone-cutting methods or masonry styles that don't match the abilities attributed to the cultures traditionally associated with them. This disconnect doesn't mean these cultures lacked the skill. It may simply mean that earlier knowledge was lost or forgotten. Still, when people see highly refined stonework beneath layers of soil, they imagine that the builders belong to a society that may have vanished before their contributions were fully recorded. When these tools, structures, and fragments appear in disparate regions with similar characteristics, the puzzle grows larger. How is it that so many places show hints of forgotten craftsmanship? Why do tools appear that seem more advanced than the context around them suggests? What happened to the people who made them? These questions don't require extraordinary explanations. They simply challenge us to rethink how civilizations rise, evolve, and disappear. Another piece of the puzzle involves the durability of certain materials. Stone, metal, and fired clay tend to survive far longer than wood, textiles, or paper. This means that the tools we find from ancient civilizations represent only a fraction of their cultural output. Written records may have decayed long ago. Wooden structures may have rotted. Clothing may have dissolved. But the durable tools remain. This selective preservation creates an uneven view of the past. We see the objects without seeing the context in which they were used. We learn about the tools, but not about the people who wielded them. People exploring buried civilizations imagine how much might have disappeared that would have explained the context of these artifacts. If soil layers shifted suddenly, burying entire settlements, then many fragile cultural products would have been lost forever. The tools would remain without the stories that gave them meaning. This imbalance, where the functional survives but the narrative does not, creates the impression of civilizations whose tools outlived their names. Even in well-studied civilizations, only fragments of their lives remain today. In cases where entire cultures disappeared without written language or left behind only a few physical remnants, it becomes even harder to understand who they were. When tools are found deep underground, in layers that confuse their placement, people naturally wonder whether such civilizations met sudden, unexpected events that altered their landscapes. If the ground rose around them or engulfed them, their histories might have been buried along with their buildings and artifacts. Sometimes the most intriguing discoveries come from accidental excavations. Workers digging trenches uncover objects that look too advanced for the layers in which they're found. Landowners stumble upon tools that don't match the known history of the region. Farmers plowing fields reveal artifacts that appear mismatched with the surrounding soil. These chance discoveries often fuel curiosity, encouraging people to imagine that entire chapters of human development might remain concealed beneath the surface. Tools that outlive their cultures are also reminders of how easily human achievements can be erased. A flood, a landslide, a sudden shift in the landscape. All of these can transform a thriving community into a buried memory. Without written records or surviving oral traditions, the tools become the only evidence that the people ever existed. They hint at skill, creativity, and daily life. They show how people shaped their world, but they offer only a partial view, leaving the rest to speculation. Thinking about these forgotten civilizations leads naturally into broader reflections about what might lie buried beneath existing cities. If entire layers of settlements remain hidden under soil and streets, then the tools uncovered today may represent only the uppermost remnants of societies that once flourished. The deeper layers might contain artifacts belonging to cultures whose names were never recorded, whose languages disappeared, and whose buildings remain sealed in darkness. This line of thought encourages people to imagine a timeline that is more intricate and layered than the standard narrative suggests. Instead of one civilization replacing another cleanly, there may have been overlapping periods, sudden disruptions, and forgotten eras preserved only in fragments. Tools that survive such events become keys to unlocking those hidden chapters, even if the doors they belong to no longer exist. And as you think about these possibilities, another question emerges naturally. If tools can survive long after their makers vanish, what about the traces of disasters that may have engulfed those cultures? What about the geological signatures left behind by events that reshaped the land? Nobody ever expects silence to be the biggest clue that something enormous happened. People normally look for ruins, legends, written accounts, or physical evidence that can be measured and cataloged. Yet, when it comes to imagining a sudden flood of earth sweeping across a landscape, engulfing homes, markets, roads, and entire neighborhoods, the absence of recorded memory often becomes the most striking feature. This quiet, this gap where human voices should be, is what pulls many people deeper into the possibility that something sudden and overwhelming might have occurred long before modern record-keeping was capable of describing it in detail. After all, if a community was overtaken in a single day or a single night, the survivors would not have had time to write careful accounts. Their focus would have been on living through the aftermath, not documenting the moment. And if the survivors themselves were few or forced to leave the region, the silence left behind would become permanent. When people consider the idea of sudden burial, they often imagine the physical side first: the mud, the destruction, the weight of earth pressing against buildings. But the aftermath of such an event would have been felt most keenly in what didn't get passed down. Entire settlements might have vanished from collective memory, simply because no one remained who could tell the story. If you picture a settlement with 100 or 1,000 residents, and then imagine those residents facing a catastrophic environmental event, it becomes clear how easily knowledge could vanish. If the people fled to another area, perhaps far away, their oral traditions might reduce the event down to a warning or a symbolic tale intended to teach resilience rather than preserve precise historical detail. Over generations, that warning could shift, soften, or merge with other stories until the original event became unrecognizable. The silence that follows a disaster isn't simply an absence of words. It is a missing explanation for physical evidence that still exists. People today walk over buried floors, past sunken entrances, and study tools that seem older or out of place. They see layers of earth that don't conform neatly to the expected timeline. They notice that entire structures appear preserved beneath the surface as though sealed in a moment. And they wonder why no records describe such a dramatic change. But silence doesn't necessarily mean nothing happened. Sometimes it simply means that the event was so overwhelming that the survivors never had the means to record it in a lasting way. Imagine for a moment what a sudden flood of earth would have looked like from the perspective of those experiencing it. There might be a rumble in the distance, a low vibration traveling through the ground. People step outside to investigate and notice that the soil is moving. Not like ordinary erosion, not like a steady flow of water, but like a wave of mud, thick enough to engulf everything in its path. They tried to warn neighbors. They tried to gather essentials, but the speed of such an event could make preparation nearly impossible. Homes would be swallowed before people had a chance to react. Streets would disappear under a rising sea of soil. Buildings designed to last generations could be overtaken in minutes. In the aftermath, survivors would stand on new ground. Where their homes once stood, there would be only a flat expanse of mud, perhaps already beginning to dry. The desire to dig out what was buried might be strong, but the scale of the disaster would make it unmanageable. Without modern machinery, removing even a foot of compacted earth would take days. Removing several feet would be nearly impossible. If an entire settlement was buried under 6, 10, or 12 ft of mud, there would be no realistic way to recover it. people would have to move on, building new homes on higher land or leaving the region entirely. Their old lives would remain sealed beneath the ground. Events like this have occurred in recorded history, though on smaller scales. There are documented cases of towns overtaken by mudslides, volcanic debris, or river sediment. In some cases, entire communities were buried quickly, and the survivors described the event as sudden and overwhelming. But because these events happened in eras where writing was more common, we have accounts that help us understand them. In ancient times, before widespread literacy, similar events could have erased small civilizations entirely, leaving behind physical evidence, but no written memory. The silence becomes not an indication of impossibility, but a reminder of how fragile human accounts are when placed against the forces of nature. People studying buried structures sometimes wonder whether this is exactly what happened in certain regions. They see buildings that appear intact beneath layers of earth that seem too thick for the settlement's age. They observe lower floors that remain preserved as if frozen in time. They notice patterns of soil distribution that suggest rapid deposition, and they realize that no documents, legends, or historical texts described the moment when the ground rose so dramatically. That absence raises questions. If the event was slow, it would have been noticed, discussed, and recorded in some form. If it was sudden, the people experiencing it might not have survived or might not have been in positions to leave lasting accounts. Another reason the silence feels significant is that cultures impacted by sudden disasters sometimes adopt new narratives afterward, narratives focused on warning future generations. These narratives often survive in symbolic or mythologized form, stripped of specific details, but preserving the emotional memory of something terrible happened. Flood myths exist in many cultures. Landslide myths do as well. Stories of cities swallowed by the earth appear across continents. While they don't prove anything directly, they show that people have long used stories to encode traumatic events. Over time, practical details disappear, replaced by metaphor or moral lessons. This natural evolution of oral history can easily blur the distinction between real past events and symbolic storytelling, leaving modern people with hints but no clear explanation. This is one of the reasons people exploring the mud flood idea pay attention to mythology, not for literal interpretation, but for patterns. If multiple cultures describe sudden burial, sudden floods, or sudden changes to the land, these shared themes might stem from real events that occurred long before written language became widespread. Oral traditions don't last forever. They can survive for centuries, maybe even millennia, but eventually they become distorted or lost. Meanwhile, the physical evidence, buried buildings, sunken entrances, sealed rooms, remains unchanged beneath the surface. The ground remembers even when the stories do not. Some people also point out that the regions most associated with puzzling architectural features, often having incomplete historical records for certain time periods. There might be gaps of decades or even centuries in which very little was written or preserved. Historians often attribute these gaps to wars, fires, political upheaval, or natural decay. But gaps in the record also leave space where a sudden environmental event could have occurred without leaving behind detailed documentation. When people imagine what might have happened during these gaps, the idea of a sudden flood of Earth becomes one of the possibilities that align with the physical evidence visible today. Another element of silence involves the absence of rebuilding. If a city was buried quickly, why didn't people dig it out? Why didn't they recover their possessions, restore their buildings, or rebuild in the same place? The answer may lie in the scale of the disaster. Removing several feet of compacted mud by hand would have been unthinkable for communities without large labor forces or advanced tools. It would have been easier to build new homes nearby than to salvage the buried remains. Over time, the buried structures would become forgotten. A new generation might grow up unaware that their city once stood at a lower level. 100 years later, the buried layer might be rediscovered only by accident during construction or excavation. The silence that follows such events doesn't reflect a lack of significance. It reflects the priorities of survival. People rebuilding their lives focus on food, shelter, safety, and community. Writing detailed accounts of what happened, especially if literacy was limited, would have been as distant concern. And if the event occurred before writing was common in the region, then the story would have survived only as long as it remained relevant to the community. Once the immediate danger passed and new generations grew up on higher ground, the story might seem distant or unnecessary. The memory would fade naturally, leaving behind no trace except the physical evidence buried underground. When we look at buried buildings today, we often approach them through the lens of modern expectations. We expect explanations. We expect documentation. That the people who lived through these events didn't think in terms of future archaeologists or historians. They thought in terms of survival and adaptation. Silence becomes the natural outcome of that mindset. There's also the issue of how civilizations interpret disasters. In some cultures, catastrophic events were attributed to divine forces or spiritual imbalance rather than environmental conditions. When such interpretations dominate, the practical details of the event may not be preserved. Instead, the story becomes a symbolic account of moral or spiritual lessons. Over time, the literal meaning fades, and only the symbolic elements remain. Modern readers might see these stories as myths, unaware that they could be rooted in real environmental events that once reshaped entire regions. When people today notice buried doorways, mismatched soil layers, and artifacts found at unexpected depths, they sometimes wonder whether the silence surrounding these features hints at something extraordinary. They don't imagine global cataclysms or impossible timelines. Instead, they consider whether regional disasters, perhaps occurring across multiple areas over several centuries, might have left behind traces that survived physically, but vanished from cultural memory. This perspective doesn't require rewriting history. It simply adds nuance to the idea that the ground beneath our feet may hold more stories than we currently recognize. The silence becomes particularly compelling when combined with what we now know about natural disasters. Geologists can describe how quickly landscapes can change. Historians can show how easily records disappear. Anthropologists can explain how oral traditions shift over time. When these understandings intersect, the lack of written memory becomes less mysterious and more consistent with how human knowledge tends to fade when confronted with events that exceed the capacity of a society to fully record. People who explore the mud flood idea often talk about how silence feels like the final step in the process of burial. First, the land is changed. Then the buildings are engulfed. Then, the survivors move on. Then, the memory fades. By the time modern society uncovers the buried evidence, the voice of the event has long since disappeared. All that remains of physical clues and unanswered questions. This doesn't mean the silence is intentional. It isn't a cover-up or a conspiracy. It's simply what happens when time moves forward, and human memory cannot keep pace with geological change. The Earth remembers through layers. Humans remember through stories. When the stories vanish, the Earth's version becomes the only remaining record. If sudden burial could silence an entire community, then how might it alter the larger record of human history? What happens when the tools survive, but the stories do not? What happens when the buildings remain, but the people's names vanish? It's surprising how easily human beings can reshape the past without ever intending to. Most people think of rewriting history as something deliberate, something carried out by governments or historians with agendas. But in reality, the most significant changes to our collective understanding of the past often happen quietly through everyday decisions, through the natural fading of memory, and through the practical choices communities make when they face uncertainty, upheaval, or transformation. These changes don't feel dramatic at the time. They feel necessary, reasonable, or simply convenient. And yet, over generations, they alter the story of what once happened, shifting the details, omitting entire episodes, or creating new narratives to fill the gaps left behind. When people rebuild after a disaster, whether it's a flood, a landslide, an earthquake, or a sudden rise in the ground, they rarely take the time to record every detail of what they lost. They repair what they can, abandon what's beyond saving, and adjust to the new reality. Their focus is on moving forward. Future generations growing up in the rebuilt environment often assume that the world has always looked the way it does now. They see a street level, a building height, a landscape contour, and they accept it as permanent. The idea that entire sections of a city might lie beneath them never crosses their minds unless someone happens to dig deep enough to stumble upon the older layers. This kind of unintentional rewriting happens everywhere. A town raises its streets to improve drainage, and within 4 or 5 generations, nobody remembers that the original ground level was several feet lower. A population relocates after a natural event, leaving behind structures that later become buried. And the story of why they left becomes a vague memory or a myth that loses detail over time. What begins as a practical adaptation slowly turns into a forgotten history. The physical evidence remains, but the explanation for it diminishes until it disappears entirely. Another way humans rewrite history unintentionally is through simplification. Stories naturally compress as they pass from one generation to the next. People remember the emotional tone of events far more vividly than the factual details. A catastrophic mud event might, over centuries, become the Great Flood in local stories, even if the actual cause was soil movement rather than water. A description of the earth rising might transform into a tale of divine punishment, or a symbolic narrative reflecting cultural beliefs. Once written records begin to appear, they often reflect the simplified versions of older oral stories, not the detailed accounts of what truly occurred. Archaeologists encounter this phenomenon frequently. They find settlements whose construction methods suggest advanced knowledge, yet the written histories nearby never mention the people who built them. They find layers of occupation stacked so tightly that the transitions between them suggest rapid change, not gradual evolution. And yet, the texts left behind from later periods sometimes describe these earlier inhabitants in vague or dismissive terms, not out of malice, but because the memory of who they were had already begun to fade. Over time, the combination of physical evidence and incomplete story leads to interpretations that may or may not reflect the original truth. Another factor that shapes our understanding of the past is the way people interpret evidence through the lens of their own time. When a building appears partially buried, a modern observer might assume that the lower level was always a basement. But someone from the time the building was constructed might have walked directly through that buried doorway, unaware that future generations would only see a fraction of the original design. In this way, present assumptions inadvertently overwrite earlier realities. We fill in the gaps with explanations that make sense to us, even if they don't match what actually happened. The same thing happens with tools and artifacts. When an object looks too advanced for the layer in which it's found, a modern scholar might assume it was displaced, dropped, or intrusive. And often that's correct. But sometimes objects appear in unusual context because the layers themselves shifted in ways we don't fully understand. Instead of imagining sudden geological events, people reinterpret the evidence according to established frameworks, inadvertently rewriting the story of how those objects came to rest where they are. This isn't deception, it's human nature. We make sense of the world using the information available, filling in missing pieces with our best guesses. Time also plays a role in shaping how history is rewritten. Over centuries, languages change, borders shift, and cultural identities evolve. A city that once belonged to one civilization might later be absorbed into another. The new inhabitants might not fully understand the structures left behind by earlier groups. They might incorporate those structures into their own buildings, repurpose them, or even build over them without knowing their true age or purpose. In doing so, they unintentionally obscure the history of the people who came before them. Eventually, archaeologists must piece together clues from multiple periods, trying to determine which layers belong to which culture. The result is a reconstruction of history that, while careful and informed, is still constrained by what remains visible. A striking example of unintentional rewriting occurs when communities rename places. A valley once known for a devastating landslide might later receive a new name that reflects its agricultural output or its scenic appeal. The original name tied to a traumatic event fades. Centuries later, people exploring the region might see clues of ancient trauma in the landforms, but find no written record explaining them. The silence around the event becomes a blank space where history once lived. Over time, the blank space gets filled with assumptions that reflect the present, not the past. Even everyday maintenance contributes to the slow rewriting of history. Repairs, renovations, and rebuilding modify structures in ways that hide earlier features. A buried doorway might be sealed with bricks during a renovation because it no longer aligns with the street level. A window partially covered by rising soil might be repurposed as a ventilation shaft. A staircase leading to a lower floor might be filled in or walled off. These changes accumulate, and over several decades or centuries, the original layout becomes almost impossible to reconstruct without deliberate excavation. People walking past the building have no reason to question its design. The modifications feel natural. The hidden history beneath them becomes accidental archaeology. Maps play a significant role, too. Cartographers in earlier centuries often worked with limited information, assumptions, or incomplete surveys. When a map from one era shows a city at a particular elevation or with a particular layout, and a later map shows it differently, people sometimes assume that the earlier map was simply inaccurate. But in some cases, both maps were accurate for their time. The landscape changed, streets were raised, foundations were buried. As the changes occurred, newer maps reflected the new reality, effectively overwriting the old one. Unless someone compares the maps in detail, the shift goes unnoticed. Cultural narratives also influence the way history is rewritten unconsciously. Societies like to see themselves as stable, resilient, and continuous. Acknowledging that entire sections of cities were once buried suddenly can feel unsettling. So communities might explain these changes in ways that fit the broader narrative of slow, steady development. They describe raised streets as logical improvements, not as responses to dramatic environmental events. They attribute buried floors to intentional design choices rather than sudden shifts in the earth. The explanations become normalized, and within a few generations, people accept them without question. Another subtle way history gets reshaped involves the distinction between what people choose to preserve and what they allow to disappear. When resources are limited, communities often focus on protecting structures that hold symbolic or cultural value while neglecting those that seem ordinary. As a result, the artifacts and buildings that survive tend to represent a narrow slice of the past, while the more mundane elements, where daily life actually occurred, are lost. This selective preservation creates a distorted view of history, emphasizing grand monuments over the lived experiences of the majority. The buried doorways and sunken streets left behind then appear anomalous simply because the context that once explained them no longer exists. Even within scientific study, interpretations evolve. A soil layer, once believed to have formed gradually, might later be reinterpreted as evidence of rapid deposition. A building once considered a basement might later be recognized as a ground floor structure, buried by changing terrain. But these reinterpretations happen slowly, sometimes over decades. During that time, textbooks, educational materials, and public understanding continue to reflect earlier assumptions. Only a small number of specialists keep track of the updates. Most people continue to understand the past through frameworks that have since been refined or replaced. When examining how humans rewrite history, it becomes clear that the process is rarely malicious. It is simply the natural outcome of living in a world that changes faster than our stories can keep up. Landscapes shift, cities transform, cultures migrate, languages fade, and through all of this, people do their best to make sense of what remains. If the ground rises, they adapt. If buildings become buried, they modify them. If memories fade, they replace them with new interpretations. The result is a version of history that feels coherent in the present, but may not accurately reflect the past. This understanding connects directly to the idea of buried civilizations and sudden environmental events. If such events occurred, the people living through them would have adapted in ways that unintentionally obscured their own history. The layers we see today, soil, architecture, artifacts, hold clues. But those clues must be interpreted through a lens shaped by centuries of forgetting and reimagining. The challenge lies in recognizing how much of the past may have been rewritten, not through intention, but through necessity and circumstance. When viewed through this lens, the mystery deepens. If human beings reshape the past simply by rebuilding, renaming, and reinterpreting their surroundings, how much of what we believe about ancient history is shaped by these subtle influences? How many buried layers represent not just physical changes, but lost stories? How many civilizations disappeared, not because they lacked significance, but because the earth moved faster than their ability to record what happened? Every culture tells stories that grew out of something real, even if the details have changed beyond recognition. People don't usually invent tales out of thin air. They reshape something they experienced, something their ancestors endured, or something they observed in the natural world around them. Over long stretches of time, those early observations soften into symbolic language, shifting from practical warnings into narratives that entertain, teach, or guide moral behavior. But if you listen closely, carefully enough to look past the polished surface of the story, you can sometimes hear the faint outline of events that might have been remembered once before the centuries settled in and blurred everything. Myths feel like fiction on the surface, yet many of them carry an unexpected gravity, as if they're echoing something older than anyone alive today can explain. Across the world, people have passed down tales of lands disappearing, cities sinking, or the ground swallowing entire settlements without warning. Some stories frame these events as divine punishment. Others describe them as natural upheavals. Many place them at the edges of human memory, in a distant past where the boundary between fact and interpretation becomes difficult to draw. When people interested in the possibility of sudden earth movement study these myths, they aren't looking for literal proof. They aren't expecting a legend to translate word for word into geological explanation. Instead, they're observing the patterns. How similar motifs appear in cultures that never interacted. How certain images repeat again and again across continents. How descriptions of sudden burial, rising earth, or swallowed cities persist even in places where no written record survived. When you lay these stories side by side, something curious happens. They begin to resemble scattered fragments of a shared memory, the kind of memory that becomes symbolic when the details fade, but the emotional core remains strong. It's similar to how a family might pass down a story from generations ago. Over time, the names change, the setting shifts, the explanation becomes metaphorical, but the sense of something impactful remains. Myths operate the same way on a cultural scale. They carry impressions of real events long after the specific facts have dissolved. Many ancient cultures described floods that reshaped entire landscapes. These aren't always water floods. Sometimes the stories mention mud, earth, or ground that moved as though it were alive. One tale might speak of a city disappearing beneath layers of earth that rolled like water. Another might describe the shaking ground that swallowed all dwellings at once. These phrases don't sound like the language of someone explaining seasonal flooding or slow geological change. They sound like attempts to describe events that happen too quickly and too forcefully for the people experiencing them to fully comprehend. People exploring the mud flood topic often find themselves wondering whether these stories represent collective memories of disasters that geological layers now hint at. The myths don't need to be accurate to be meaningful. They only need to preserve enough of the emotional truth to suggest that something dramatic once occurred. And in many cultures, the emotional truth of these stories points towards sudden loss. Loss of homes, loss of certainty, and loss of the familiar world. There's a reason so many myths begin with a catastrophe. Catastrophes leave deep impressions on communities. They reshape lives and demand reinterpretation. When people survive such events, they seek ways to understand them, and myth becomes one of the tools they use. If the earth suddenly rose and buried an entire settlement, the survivors might not have been able to explain the geological processes behind it. They might have interpreted the event through the lens of their existing beliefs. Over centuries, those interpretations would harden into myth. Take, for example, the stories in various cultures that speak of the old world that lies beneath our feet. These stories often describe past eras not as distant, thriving civilizations, but as hidden realms buried under earth or stone. The phrasing varies from one culture to another. Sometimes it's the world before the breaking. Sometimes the city under the hill. Sometimes the buried kingdom. But the idea remains consistent. Something that once existed was covered by earth and forgotten. To people studying physical evidence of sudden burial, these myths feel strikingly familiar. They parallel the idea that structures and civilizations may lie beneath modern ground levels, sealed away by layers of sediment. Another recurring theme involves stories of sudden transformation. In some myths, the land changes abruptly. Mountains rise, valleys fall, or entire regions sink. The people in these stories often have no warning. The change is described as instant, unstoppable, and incomprehensible. While many of these stories are told in symbolic language, meant to reinforce spiritual or cultural values, the underlying pattern of landscape shifting faster than human understanding resonates with scenarios where natural disasters reshape the terrain in a matter of hours or days. People also notice that myths describing buried cities often include details that sound strangely practical. Instead of vague, poetic imagery, some tales mention doorways blocked by earth, windows filled with mud, or streets that vanished under a blanket of soil. These descriptions resemble the physical evidence in modern cities, where doorways sit below the street, or where windows open directly into compacted earth. While myths alone cannot prove anything, the overlap between these details and the architectural anomalies noted today invites curiosity. In other cases, myths emphasize survival and adaptation rather than the event itself. They describe people moving to higher ground, abandoning their old homes, or building new settlements on top of the buried ones. These stories don't always frame the event as punishment. Sometimes they simply present it as an unfortunate circumstance, a moment when nature acted unpredictably. The pragmatic tone of these stories makes them feel closer to memory than metaphor, as if the storytellers were trying to preserve a lesson rather than a legend. Another interesting aspect of these myths is how rarely they describe gradual change. Cultures with strong agricultural traditions often understood the slow passage of time intuitively. They paid close attention to seasonal patterns, soil behavior, and long-term shifts in the landscape. When they described environmental changes sudden, It suggests that the events they were recalling felt truly abrupt. Stories told in regions with stable geological histories sometimes include descriptions of single nights where the world shifted, or mornings when people awoke to discover their surroundings altered beyond recognition. The emotional tone of these passages, the shock, the confusion, the sense of loss, calls to mind the same questions that arise when people today stand in front of a buried doorway and wonder what caused it. These myths also highlight how human memory functions when confronted with overwhelming events. People don't always record the facts in a systematic way. Instead, they preserve the emotional impression, the fear, the awe, the devastation, and allow the details to fall away. Over time, the emotional core becomes the myth, while the event itself becomes harder to identify. This dynamic mirrors what happens when children hear stories from grandparents whose grandparents told them similar stories. The specifics fade, the feelings remain. Some scholars point out that many flood myths, whether involving water, mud, or earth, share structural similarities. They begin with a thriving community, followed by a sudden environmental upheaval, followed by migration or rebuilding. This sequence appears in stories from Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. People who examine these myths through the lens of geological possibility often wonder whether different cultures might be recalling separate events that followed a similar pattern: sudden burial, loss, and adaptation. Or perhaps multiple events occurred across centuries, each leaving its mark on the cultural memory of different regions. It's also worth noting that myths sometimes preserve details that were practical originally, even if they later became symbolic. For instance, some stories warn people not to build homes too close to certain hillsides or riverbanks. While these warnings might sound like moral teachings on the surface, they often reflect memories of disasters that once affected the community. Over generations, as the reason for the warning faded, the story became myth. But the practical core, avoid building where the ground once shifted, remained. When looking at myths that describe the old world hidden beneath the soil, it becomes interesting to compare them with archaeological findings. In some cities, older layers of streets, walls, and entire neighborhoods lie directly below the modern surface, preserved as though someone placed a new city on top of the old one. These physical layers mirror the narrative layers in myths. Both suggest that earlier civilizations were buried physically and metaphorically by time. Whether the cause was sudden or gradual, the effect remains the same: a world covered and forgotten, remembered only through symbolic stories or chance excavations. Myths also reveal something important about how humans process loss. When a community loses its homes, landmarks, or familiar landscapes, the people often craft stories to maintain a sense of continuity. The myth becomes a bridge between the world that was and the world that is. If a sudden flood of earth buried part of their settlement, they might describe it as the earth consuming the land. If they found themselves rebuilding on higher ground, they might tell a story about rising land or a divine command to seek safer terrain. These stories help communities make sense of what happened, even when the precise causes remain unknown or too painful to fully confront. People studying buried architecture and mismatched soil layers often find comfort in the idea that myths could represent distant echoes of real events. They don't take the myths literally. Instead, they view them as clues, imperfect, symbolic, but still connected to something tangible. When a culture describes the time when the earth covered the people's homes, it doesn't prove that a mud flood occurred. But it does suggest that at some point, something happened that left a lasting impression strong enough to survive for centuries. Another layer of fascination comes from the geographical spread of these stories. Cultures separated by oceans, climates, and languages sometimes share strikingly similar narratives. This could simply be coincidence. Many human experiences are universal, and different communities might independently create similar stories. But the resemblance also raises the possibility that certain kinds of environmental events occurred widely enough or frequently enough to become embedded in human culture across multiple regions. This doesn't mean that one global event occurred. It means that humans everywhere have faced sudden changes in their landscapes, and the memory of those changes persists in the form of myth. For people exploring the idea of sudden burial events, this broad pattern of shared storytelling feels significant. It suggests a global pattern, not of a single disaster, but of how humans respond to environmental upheaval. The stories they tell sound like memories transformed by time. As you think about myths that sound suspiciously like memories, it becomes easier to see how the pieces fit together. Buried doorways, sunken streets, mismatched soil layers, preserved rooms, forgotten tools, and fading stories all align in a way that encourages curiosity. Each piece doesn't prove anything alone, but when placed side by side, they create a larger picture, one where humans have lived through events they couldn't fully explain, passed down stories that slowly morphed into legends, and rebuilt on top of worlds they no longer remembered. Most people don't spend much time wondering whether the ground beneath them could ever move fast enough to bury an entire neighborhood. It feels like the kind of question that belongs in old stories or distant tragedies, not in the steady routine of everyday life. Yet, once someone becomes aware of how much of the past appears to lie beneath modern layers of soil, doorways lowered into the earth, streets hidden under newer streets, artifacts preserved far below their expected layers, it becomes natural to ask whether such changes could occur again. Not through imagination or myth, but through the forces that genuinely shape the planet. The Earth hasn't stopped shifting simply because modern society feels stable. Landscapes still change. Rivers still move. Hillsides still collapse. The question is whether the combination of circumstances that may have buried older worlds could happen again, in a way that feels sudden, overwhelming, or transformative. To answer this thoughtfully, it helps to begin by acknowledging what the Earth is capable of. Around the world, there are documented cases of towns lost to landslides in a single afternoon. Entire hillsides can loosen during heavy rainfall, sending tens of thousands of tons of mud sliding into valleys, covering roads, farms, and homes. In volcanic regions, pyrolastic flows and liahars, fast-moving rivers of hot ash or thick mud, have swallowed entire settlements within minutes. In floodplains, rivers occasionally shift course during extreme storms, depositing meters of sediment in areas that previously sat well above water level. None of this is hypothetical. These events are recorded clearly in modern times, captured in photos, reports, and eyewitness accounts. And yet, even with these real examples available, people rarely imagine similar events happening where they live. They assume such disasters belong to distant mountains or unstable regions. But the truth is that any place with loose soil, steep terrain, or unpredictable water patterns has the potential to experience sudden, large-scale movement. The stability people feel today is often a product of short-term familiarity, not long-term geological certainty. Thinking about whether a mud flood could happen again requires looking at the conditions that allow rapid burial to occur. One of the most important factors is water. When soil becomes saturated, either from prolonged rainfall, sudden storms, melting snow, or a rise in groundwater levels, it loses cohesion. What once felt solid can start behaving almost like a liquid. If the soil sits on a slope, gravity pulls it downward. If the soil rests in a valley, it can pile up quickly, creating thick layers that didn't exist before. Water acts as both trigger and transport, moving Earth in ways that feel deceptively fast. Urban development can increase the likelihood of such events. Roads, paved surfaces, and drainage systems alter the natural flow of water. When intense storms hit an area where the ground can't absorb moisture quickly, the water runs off at the surface, collecting sediment and accelerating erosion. If a hillside is already unstable due to construction or vegetation loss, the sudden pressure from runoff can release the soil in a rush. Modern cities may have advanced engineering, but they also introduce new vulnerabilities, especially as climate patterns grow more unpredictable. Climate change contributes directly to these conditions. Many regions now experience heavier rainfall than they did a century ago. Storms grow more intense. Weather patterns shift rapidly. These changes create environments where saturated soil becomes more common, increasing the possibility of sudden landslides or mud flows. Even areas without a history of dramatic geological movement can face new risks as rainfall patterns intensify. A city that once experienced mild seasonal rains might now encounter storms capable of destabilizing entire hillsides. But rainfall alone doesn't tell the whole story. Earthquakes can also trigger rapid soil movement. Even small tremors can loosen sediment in areas where the ground is already unstable. If an earthquake occurs during a wet season, the combination becomes particularly dangerous. Soil that might otherwise hold together can slip suddenly, carrying everything in its path. These events don't need to reach catastrophic magnitudes to cause significant burial. A moderate shift is enough to create layers thick enough to cover lower floors, entrances, or streets. In regions where rivers have been redirected or heavily managed, another risk emerges. A redirected river may behave unpredictably during extreme weather, overflowing into areas previously considered safe. When rivers flood with enough force, they can carry vast amounts of sediment. The water deposits that sediment as it slows, sometimes creating new layers several feet thick. If buildings stand nearby, the sediment can rise around them quickly, creating the kind of buried levels people observe in much older architecture. While modern flood controls mitigate much of this risk, infrastructure can still fail, especially under stress from extreme conditions. Urban excavation also reveals something relevant here. The Earth doesn't always move gradually. Sometimes large pockets of soil shift at once. Sinkholes form, retaining walls collapse. Groundwater channels carve out hidden voids beneath the surface. When these voids give way, the earth above can settle rapidly, lowering entire sections of land in a single event. In extreme cases, such collapses can mimic the effects of sudden burial, with structures ending up partially or completely submerged in earth. As modern societies grow larger and more complex, the ways humans modify the landscape can unintentionally increase the potential for rapid ground movement. Removing forests, reshaping hillsides, altering coastlines, or building on reclaimed land can all introduce new stresses to the environment. If these stresses combine with natural forces, such as heavy rain or seismic activity, the likelihood of rapid soil displacement grows. In this sense, modern development creates new possibilities for events that might resemble the burial scenarios people see in older cities. So, is it possible for a mud flood, sudden, forceful, and transformative, to happen again? The answer is neither simple nor dramatic. It isn't a matter of predicting a global event or imagining a world-changing catastrophe. Instead, it's about recognizing that local or regional events of similar scale already do occur, and they could happen again in ways that would reshape familiar environments. History shows that landscapes can transform quickly. Modern examples confirm it, and geological processes haven't slowed. The real question then is not whether such an event is possible, but how prepared modern societies are for the unexpected. Today, engineers build retaining walls, drainage systems, and foundations designed to withstand a range of forces. But even the best designs depend on accurate predictions of rainfall, soil behavior, and seismic activity. When conditions exceed expectations, structures can fail. The idea of buried buildings in the future isn't far-fetched. It simply requires a combination of forces: heavy rainfall, unstable ground, rapid saturation, or seismic movement to align at the wrong moment. But there's another angle to consider: how such an event would be remembered. Unlike ancient civilizations, modern societies have extensive recording systems. Cameras, written records, digital archives, and scientific analysis ensure that any major geological event would be documented in detail. Even smaller-scale disasters receive coverage that helps preserve the memory for future generations. The silence that surrounds possible ancient burial events would be replaced today by clear accounts, photographs, and measurements. The physical aftermath would still be dramatic, but it wouldn't vanish into myth. However, memory and documentation do not prevent the event itself from happening. They only preserve its explanation. A modern mud flood wouldn't rewrite history the way past events may have, but it could still reshape familiar places. It could still bury infrastructure, homes, and streets. It could still force communities to rebuild on higher ground. And over decades, the buried layers would remain as new construction rose above them, just as older layers sit beneath modern cities today. Another consideration is how natural events scale. A mud flow that buries a few homes on a hillside is tragic, but not transformative on a civilizational scale. But if rare conditions converge, the kind that occur once every few centuries, a larger event could affect entire districts, valleys, or small cities. This possibility doesn't require imagination. It only requires looking at places where floods or landslides have already altered landscapes dramatically. In some regions, valleys that were once bustling towns now lie beneath layers of sediment deposited during a single historic event. If such an event happened before extensive record keeping, the memory might have faded, much like the myths discussed earlier. Some people speculate about global-scale mud events, imagining vast regions changing rapidly at once. Such scenarios enter the realm of theory rather than practical geological reality based on current understanding. But the possibility of widespread regional events occurring at different times in different places remains firmly within geological plausibility. In this sense, the Earth doesn't need a singular global disaster to reshape human environments. It only needs enough local events to accumulate over time, creating the pattern of buried structures we see today. So, could something like that happen again? Yes, in the same way it has already happened before. Quietly in some regions, dramatically in others, depending on conditions. But modern tools, observation methods, and understanding of geology would change how such an event is perceived. People today are far more aware of environmental risks. They monitor rainfall, soil moisture, seismic activity, and infrastructure stability. Even with these tools, though, nature remains unpredictable, and it only takes one unexpected shift to alter a landscape in ways that seem sudden. What's more interesting is how people would interpret such an event in the future. If centuries from now, new generations stand above the remnants of today's cities, examining buried levels and mismatched soil layers, they might wonder how their ancestors explain the changes. They might look at old buildings sunk into the ground and ask why the lower floors became sealed in earth. They might examine tools, artifacts, or documents found at unexpected depths and wonder how the layers became mixed. Even with modern documentation, future observers would still interpret the past through the lens of their own time, just as people do today. Thinking about this possibility adds another dimension to the mudflation. It suggests that the buried worlds we study may not be anomalies, but part of a much broader, repeating pattern in human history. Civilizations rise on landscapes they assume are stable. The land shifts. The structures sink or become buried. People adapt. Future generations reinterpret the evidence, and the cycle continues. This perspective leads naturally into one more question. Not a fearful one, but a curious one. If the ground can change so dramatically, and if forgotten layers of human life already lie beneath our feet, then what responsibilities do we carry when interpreting the evidence they left behind? Most people expect the past to feel solid. They imagine it as something fixed, something determined long ago, and preserved in the form of dates, timelines, artifacts, and neat diagrams in books. But the more someone studies the pieces that survived, the buried rooms, the mismatched soil layers, the sunken streets, the forgotten tools, the fading myths, the more they begin to sense that the past isn't a single, definite story at all. It's flexible. It shifts depending on what happens in the present, what gets preserved, and what disappears before anyone has a chance to record it. If anything, the past behaves more like a soft imprint than a stone carving. It can be shaped again and again as new evidence appears, or old interpretations fade, leaving behind a tapestry that is both familiar and uncertain. This uncertainty doesn't indicate confusion. Instead, it shows how deeply human beings depend on patterns to make sense of time. When those patterns break, when a buried doorway contradicts a historical explanation, or a soil layer challenges a timeline, people realize how fragile their understanding of earlier eras truly is. Every new discovery has the potential to rearrange entire chapters of human knowledge. But it also opens new possibilities, encouraging people to think about the past not as a closed story, but as something still unfolding, still revealing itself, still capable of changing how we interpret the world. The same flexibility applies to the ancient landscapes themselves. The ground beneath modern streets might contain multiple layers of old cities, each representing a community that lived, built, adapted, and eventually disappeared. Yet these stacked layers rarely tell their own story clearly. Some are preserved perfectly, others are fragmented. Still others exist only as faint outlines, almost erased by time. When someone looks at these layers, they often feel a strange mix of certainty and uncertainty. On one hand, the physical evidence is right there. On the other hand, the interpretation of that evidence could shift dramatically, depending on what else is discovered in the future. This sense of soft uncertainty becomes even more noticeable when you consider how much of human experience leaves no physical record at all. Entire cultures lived through events that shaped their identities. Yet, their stories survived only through fragile oral traditions. Those traditions eventually transformed into myths, and those myths later became disconnected from the original events that inspired them. What remains today is a series of stories that sound symbolic, but may carry faint memories of geological upheavals, environmental shifts, or lost communities that once thrived in regions where only traces remain. People exploring the idea of buried civilizations often approach this uncertainty not as a problem, but as a window. Instead of seeking absolute answers, they examine patterns, similarities, and anomalies. They notice when architectural features repeat across continents. They observe when soil tells a different story than written history. They pay attention when tools seem too refined for the layers in which they appear. Rather than accepting any single interpretation as final, they stay open to multiple possibilities, recognizing that the past may be broader and more intricate than current knowledge allows. This openness is essential because the Earth itself behaves unpredictably. Landscapes can change dramatically, sometimes over centuries, and sometimes within a single night. If multiple ancient communities experience sudden environmental changes, shifts in soil, landslides, or unexpected geological movement, their responses would become part of the archaeological record in ways that are difficult to interpret thousands of years later. People rebuilding on new ground levels might forget the lower layers existed. Over generations, the memory of the event would blur, leaving only physical remnants behind. When modern observers find these remnants, they must interpret them without the benefit of first-hand accounts. This brings forward a deeper understanding. Uncertainty doesn't weaken the story of the past. It strengthens it. It reminds people that time is layered, dynamic, and influenced by forces far larger than any single civilization. When a doorway lies beneath a street or a window faces into Earth instead of open air, it represents a moment when the world shifted and people had to adapt. When a myth describes the ground swallowing a city, it may preserve the emotional impact of something real, even if the details changed. When tools survive long after their creators vanish, they serve as fragments of lost eras, offering clues without offering closure. These fragments point toward futures as much as they point toward the past. For one thing, they show that human assumptions about permanence are often temporary. A street level that seems stable today might not stay that way forever. A neighborhood built on solid ground might shift if rainfall patterns intensify or if underground water changes course. A community sitting at the base of a hillside might remain safe for centuries until one extreme event redefines the landscape. Modern engineering offers protection, but it cannot eliminate the possibility of sudden change. The Earth has reshaped itself many times before, and it retains that ability. This recognition doesn't inspire fear, it fosters perspective. Understanding that landscapes have changed before encourages people to prepare thoughtfully for the future. It also broadens the imagination, allowing individuals to picture worlds that existed long before current cities were built, and worlds that may exist long after modern streets are forgotten. The buried layers beneath urban spaces show that the Earth doesn't discard human history. It folds it into itself. One day, modern structures may lie beneath future layers, interpreted by generations who wonder what happened here and why the ground looks the way it does. The uncertainty also highlights how interconnected human understanding of time truly is. When someone looks at a buried building, they are not just seeing architecture. They are seeing the imprint of a moment when people lived, worked, built, and adapted. They are seeing a story interrupted by geological forces. They are seeing a hint of what future generations might learn about today's world when they uncover its remnants. The past and future overlap in these buried layers, merging into a single continuous landscape of rising and falling ground. Another way this uncertainty shapes future thinking is through the realization that human interpretation is always evolving. A discovery made today may reshape a narrative accepted for centuries. A forgotten map might reveal a missing piece of information. A soil sample could challenge long-held assumptions about how quickly the Earth changed. As these new findings accumulate, they push people to reconsider what they once believed. Instead of resisting this process, embracing the uncertainty becomes a way of honoring the complexity of human history. This perspective also encourages humility. Modern societies often imagine themselves as the peak of human development, with technology and information systems giving them complete understanding of the world. But looking at the buried layers of older civilizations reveals how temporary that sense of certainty can be. Entire cultures once believed their world was stable and permanent. They built with confidence. They organized their societies with long-term vision. And yet the Earth shifted around them, leaving behind only fragments of their efforts. This doesn't diminish their accomplishments. Instead, it places them within a broader cycle of adaptation and resilience. People in the future may look back on modern civilizations in the same way, recognizing both the ingenuity and the vulnerability woven into today's structures. The uncertainty of the past becomes a reminder that every era interprets itself as stable until something challenges that belief. The soft uncertainty of the past also reshapes the way people understand possibility. It suggests that history isn't a narrow path, but a wide terrain. Lost civilizations may have existed without leaving complete records. Sudden environmental events may have reshaped entire regions. Human migrations, forgotten settlements, and technological innovations may lie waiting in soil layers yet to be uncovered. Instead of assuming that everything important has already been discovered, the uncertain past invites curiosity. It encourages continuous exploration, not to find definitive answers, but to understand how much remains unknown. This curiosity naturally extends to the future. If the past was shaped by forces that people didn't fully understand at the time, then the future may also hold surprises. Landscapes may shift again. Technologies may evolve in ways that redefine how people interact with the natural world. Communities may adapt to changing conditions just as ancient ones did, leaving behind their own buried layers and unanswered questions. Recognizing this continuity allows people to see themselves as part of a much larger story, one that doesn't begin or end with any single era. The uncertainty also makes room for imagination. People often create explanations for the past based on the evidence available. But imagination fills the gaps where evidence is missing. This isn't a flaw in understanding. It's a natural response to incomplete information. Myths, interpretations, speculative conversations, and historical reconstructions all grow out of this imaginative space. They reflect an innate desire to form meaningful narratives, even when the past refuses to provide a clear picture. These narratives can become stepping stones for future discoveries. A curious question about a buried doorway might inspire an excavation. A myth about a sunken city might prompt geological analysis. A puzzling artifact found at an unexpected depth might motivate researchers to refine their understanding of how soil moves. Imagination doesn't replace evidence. It guides people toward the places where new evidence may be found. The past softness also highlights the interconnectedness of memory and forgetting. The stories people remember shape their sense of identity. The stories they forget reshape the landscape of history without anyone noticing. Forgotten layers become the soil that future generations build upon. Forgotten stories become the myths that later cultures reinterpret. Forgotten disasters become the silent foundations of new cities. The cycle of remembering and forgetting continues endlessly, weaving together the visible and invisible parts of human experience. This realization is not unsettling. It is grounding. It reminds people that human life is part of a continuous flow of time that stretches far beyond individual generations. The buried structures beneath modern cities are not just remnants of what came before. They are reminders that change is constant. Adaptation is natural, and understanding is always evolving. And when someone stands in a modern street and senses the older world beneath their feet, they are not just thinking about the past. They are feeling the echo of futures that will one day stand above the present, shaped by forces still unfolding. The uncertainty of the past becomes a quiet invitation to look forward with the same curiosity, recognizing that the world people know today is only one layer among many, resting temporarily at the surface. The story continues not in grand conclusions, but in the steady awareness that the earth holds countless imprints waiting to be noticed, each one hinting at the fluid connection between what was, what is, and what may come next.